I am Victoria. 56 years old, and 3 months ago, my husband of 30 years tried to publicly discard me for a woman younger than our children. He thought he was throwing away a useless, aging housewife. He had no idea he was trying to evict the woman who secretly held the financial leash to his entire commercial real estate empire. Before I tell you how I smiled in his face and then legally seized everything he loved, go to the comments right now and tell me where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant man exactly who built his throne. The night my marriage ended, the air inside the Westport Country Club smelled of expensive roasted tenderloin and imported white lilies. I was wearing a navy blue silk gown. It was a beautiful piece, but it was 10 years old. I had meticulously preserved it, wearing it to every major corporate gala to save money during the early years of building his company. Beside me stood my husband, Richard. He was 58, radiating the kind of arrogant confidence that only a midlife crisis and a newly minted bank account can buy. He wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first car. It was a glaring visual summary of our marriage. I was the sturdy, overlooked foundation, and he was the shiny, expensive facade. 25 years ago, I gave up a lucrative track as a Wall Street risk analyst to balance his books for free at our kitchen table. I built the financial architecture of his real estate firm from scratch. Tonight was supposed to be the celebration of that shared sacrifice, our 30th anniversary. The room was packed with Connecticut high society. Richard picked up a heavy silver spoon and gently tapped it against his crystal champagne flute. The delicate ringing sound cut through the low hum of wealthy chatter. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the head table. Richard smiled, showing off his newly veneered teeth. He looked down at me, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a glimmer of the man I married. 30 years. Richard began, his voice booming effortlessly across the ballroom. 30 years is a lifetime. It is an era. We have built a legacy, raised a family, and achieved things most people only dream about. Everyone in the room smiled warmly. I felt a soft flush of pride. But then Richard took a deep breath and his smile vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating mask. But every era must come to an end. He continued, his tone dropping to a sterile, businesslike cadence. Growth requires change, and sometimes you have to cut away the past to make room for the future. The warmth in the ballroom evaporated. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I frowned, confusion creeping up my neck. Richard gestured to the back of the room. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped forward from the shadows. I recognized him immediately. He was a junior partner at a cutthroat family law firm in the city. The man walked briskly to our table, avoiding my gaze, and slid a thick manila envelope across the pristine white linen tablecloth. It stopped right next to my dinner plate. "I am filing for divorce," Victoria, Richard announced. His voice was loud enough for the first 3 rows of tables to hear perfectly. He did not look apologetic. He looked triumphant. "I am moving on. I have found someone who aligns with my current trajectory." Richard pointed toward a smaller table near the terrace doors. Sitting there swirling a glass of rose was Chloe. She was 26 years old, the so-called director of communications Richard had recently hired. She offered me a slow, mockingly sweet wave. Richard looked back down at me. "You have 48 hours to pack your personal items and vacate the house. As you know, the estate is technically owned by the parent company, and we need the property for a corporate retreat next week. Chloe will be overseeing the interior updates." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I looked across the table at my own flesh and blood, desperately seeking an anchor. My eldest son, Brandon, who was 32 and currently burning through his 3rd failed startup, simply looked away. He took a sip of his bourbon and shrugged. "Come on, Mom," Brandon muttered. "Dad is the one funding my new app launch next month. You have to understand, this is just business. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I turned my head, feeling completely numb, and looked at my 28-year-old daughter, Olivia. She was furiously typing on her phone, her designer handbag resting on her lap. "Olivia," I whispered. She sighed heavily, rolling her eyes as if my public humiliation was a massive inconvenience to her evening. "Mom, please do not make a scene," Olivia hissed. Chloe knows the senior editors at a major fashion magazine. She promised to help me get verified on Instagram and secure brand deals. Just take a settlement and go quietly. Next to Olivia sat her husband, Marcus. Marcus was a brilliant 30-year-old African-American man who worked as the chief compliance officer at Richard Firm. He was the only one at the table who looked absolutely sickened. Marcus slammed his hands on the table, his jaw clenched tight. "Richard, this is completely out of line," Marcus growled, leaning forward to defend me. "You do not do this to the mother of your children." But before Marcus could stand up, Olivia elbowed him sharply in the ribs and grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. "Shut up, Marcus," she snapped. "You work for my dad. Do not ruin this for us." I sat perfectly still. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. 200 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting for the hysterical tears. They waited for me to scream, to throw my wine, to beg for my home and my husband. I looked at the manila envelope. I looked at my selfish, entitled children. I looked at the arrogant man who thought he had outgrown me. The shock faded instantly, replaced by a deep glacial calm. I did not cry. I reached out and calmly picked up my linen napkin, dabbing the corners of my mouth. I reached for my glass of red wine, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. I looked directly into Richard's smug eyes and smiled a bright, terrifying smile. "Perfect timing, Richard," I said clearly, my voice steady and light. I stood up, smoothing the front of my vintage silk dress. I leaned in close so only he could hear my parting words. "Just do me one favor. Make sure you change the master passwords to the company security system by tomorrow morning." I picked up my purse, turned my back on my 30-year marriage, and walked out of the ballroom with my head held high, leaving them all completely blind to the financial slaughter I had already set in motion. The air in the Westport Country Club ballroom felt instantly heavy, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room the second the manila envelope hit the white linen tablecloth. My husband of 30 years had just publicly filed for divorce in front of 200 of our peers. I did not immediately look at the legal documents. Instead, my eyes drifted past Richard to a smaller, more intimate table positioned near the terrace doors. Sitting there, bathed in the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers, was Chloe. She was 26 years old, officially holding the title of Director of Communications at Richard Commercial Real Estate Firm. Unofficially, she was the reason my husband had started buying tailored Italian suits and obsessing over his hairline. Chloe was a calculated insult, wrapped in an emerald green backless gown. She sat with the relaxed posture of a predator who had just successfully cornered its prey. As the hushed whispers of the wealthy crowd began to ripple through the room, she did not look away in shame. When my eyes met hers, she offered a slow, deliberate smirk. It was a facial expression dripping with the kind of absolute entitlement you only see in people who have never had to build anything from the ground up. She reached for her glass of vintage rose, tilting it toward me in a mocking, silent toast before taking a delicate sip. She was not just claiming my husband. She was actively reveling in my public execution. She looked at me and saw a discarded 56-year-old relic of the past. She saw a naive housewife who was about to be left with nothing. She had absolutely no idea she was raising a glass to the woman who secretly held the financial leash to the entire empire she was trying to inherit. I tore my gaze away from the mistress and looked across our table. If Richard Betrayal was the knife in my back, I desperately needed my children to be the hands that pulled it out. I turned to my eldest child, Brandon. He was 32 years old, sitting slouched in his velvet-upholstered chair, idly swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Brandon had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one catastrophic business venture to another, from a disastrous cryptocurrency exchange to a boutique restaurant concept that folded in 6 months. He called himself a visionary entrepreneur. But his only actual talent was draining his father's bank accounts to cover his massive failures. I waited for the righteous anger of a firstborn son. I waited for Brandon to stand up, throw his drink in his father's face, and demand respect for the woman who had spent countless nights pacing the floor when he was a sick child. Instead, Brandon let out a heavy, irritated sigh. He refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at the ice cubes melting in his glass. "Come on, Mom," Brandon muttered, his voice dripping with profound annoyance. Let us be realistic here. You have to look at the big picture. Dad is the one fully funding my new tech launch next month. I am at a critical stage with my angel investors, and I cannot afford any family drama distracting him or tightening his wallet right now. You understand how these things work. It is just business. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Just take whatever settlement his lawyers are offering in that envelope and go quietly. We can talk about it later when things calm down. The words felt like physical blows landing squarely on my chest. My own son, the boy I had loved unconditionally, was prioritizing a seed funding check over his mother dignity. He was actively instructing me to surrender my 30 years of sacrifice so he could buy more time to play pretend CEO. A cold, hard knot began to tighten deep in my stomach. I turned my head slowly, seeking a lifeline from my daughter. Olivia was 28. She was dressed in a sheer designer gown, her face contoured flawlessly for the camera flashes she constantly chased. She was an aspiring social media influencer, a woman whose entire curated lifestyle was subsidized by our family credit cards. She was aggressively tapping the screen of her newest smartphone, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawn together in deep frustration. "Olivia!" I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the tense murmurs of the ballroom. She slammed her phone face down on the table and glared at me. Her expression was not one of sympathy, but of pure, unadulterated panic regarding her own social status. "Mom, please stop," she hissed under her breath. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me?" All my friends are at the table behind us. Chloe knows the senior editors at a major fashion magazine. She has connections with top-tier public relations firms in the city. She literally promised to help me get my account verified next week and secure 3 major brand sponsorships. If you throw a tantrum right now and make a scene, you are going to ruin my entire aesthetic and destroy my career momentum. Just let Dad be happy. He deserves to live his truth, and you need to accept that. Live his truth. The modern therapeutic buzzwords tasted like battery acid in my mouth. I had spent 3 decades ironing out the wrinkles of their chaotic lives. I had defended them, protected them, and quietly fixed their mistakes. And in my darkest moment, they were selling me out for an app launch and a blue checkmark on the internet. My children were not victims of a broken home. They were willing accomplices to my eviction. But there was one person at the table who was not blinded by Richard's checkbook or Chloe's superficial promises. Marcus. Marcus was my son-in-law, a brilliant 30-year-old African-American man who served as the chief compliance officer at Richard Real Estate firm. Marcus had grown up in a working-class neighborhood. He had earned every single academic scholarship and worked his way through law school. He understood the value of loyalty, the burden of hard work, and the unmistakable stench of arrogance. He was the only person in Richard corporate circle who consistently pushed back against my husband's reckless financial decisions. And tonight, he was the only one who saw Richard for exactly what he was, a pathetic fraud. Marcus' jaw was clenched so tight I could see a muscle jumping erratically in his cheek. His dark eyes were fixed on Richard with absolute burning disgust. He placed his large hands flat on the linen tablecloth, his knuckles turning slightly gray as he braced his weight to push his heavy chair back. "Richard, this is completely out of line," Marcus growled, his deep voice rumbling with barely contained fury. "You do not blindside the mother of your children in a room full of strangers. You do not disrespect Victoria like this. She built you." Marcus started to rise to his feet, his broad shoulders tensing to physically shield me from the staring crowd. It was the first act of genuine courage and love I had witnessed all night. He was ready to risk his high-paying corporate job to defend a 56-year-old woman he owed nothing to. But before Marcus could fully stand, Olivia lunged sideways in her chair. She grabbed Marcus' forearm with a vicious, frantic grip. I watched in horror as her long acrylic nails dug ruthlessly into his skin, right through the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "Sit down and shut up, Marcus," Olivia commanded, her voice a venomous, panicked whisper. "You work for my father. Your entire paycheck, our mortgage, and our lifestyle come from his company. You are not going to ruin my network and my inheritance just to play the hero for my mother. Do not bite the hand that feeds us. Stay out of this." Marcus froze. He looked down at his wife, manicured claws sinking into his arm, treating him like a disobedient employee rather than a partner. Then he looked at me. The conflict in his eyes was agonizing to witness. He was a deeply honorable man trapped in a nest of wealthy vipers. I saw a wave of profound shame wash over his face as he realized the brutal leverage his wife and father-in-law held over his entire livelihood. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his posture rigid with silent, helpless rage. He refused to look at Richard or Olivia for the rest of the night. He just looked at me, his eyes offering a silent, desperate apology. I did not blame Marcus. I could never blame him. He was a smart, decent man navigating a dangerous, toxic corporate ecosystem that was designed to crush people like him. In fact, his strategic mind and his access to the compliance records were going to be my absolute greatest assets in the weeks to come. But in that exact moment, watching a good man be forced into submission by my spoiled, entitled daughter, the final illusion of my perfect family shattered completely. The pieces fell to the floor, and I did not want to pick them back up. They were not my family. They were parasites. They had fed on my patience, my free labor, and my silent, invisible sacrifices for nearly 3 decades. And now that they believed the host body was no longer useful, they were eagerly latching onto the next shiny, wealthy thing Richard dangled in front of them. The ballroom was completely silent now. The string quartet had stopped playing in the corner. The catering staff stood frozen against the walls holding heavy silver trays of untouched appetizers. Every wealthy socialite, every real estate rival, and every gossiping neighbor in Connecticut was watching me. They were holding their breath. They expected a massive, humiliating breakdown. They expected me to scream, to flip the table, to throw my glass of wine at the mistress, or to collapse into a weeping heap of discarded domesticity. Women of my generation were culturally programmed to react to betrayal with loud, messy heartbreak. But I had spent 25 years quietly analyzing financial risk and calculating corporate leverage. I did not see a broken marriage. I saw a chessboard, and Richard had just made the stupidest move of his entire life. He thought he had trapped me in a corner. He thought stripping me of my title as his wife meant stripping me of my power. He forgot one crucial, catastrophic detail. I was the one who designed the financial maze he was proudly walking through. I looked at Brandon, who was checking his Rolex, completely bored by his mother destruction. I looked at Olivia, who was checking her reflection in her phone screen to make sure her makeup was not ruined by the tension. I looked at Chloe, who was leaning back in her chair, eagerly waiting for the keys to her new kingdom. And finally, I looked at Richard. He stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, waiting for my tears and my surrender. The sorrow instantly evaporated from my blood. The tears never came. Instead, a profound, dangerous, and icy clarity settled deep into my bones. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I reached out my hand perfectly steady and picked up my wine glass. I took one final sip of the Cabernet, enjoying the heavy oak finish, and placed it down softly on the coaster. I looked Richard dead in the eye and gave him the most radiant, peaceful smile he had seen in 20 years. The silence in the Westport Country Club ballroom was no longer just heavy. It was absolute and suffocating. 200 of the most influential people in Connecticut were holding their collective breath. I could feel the physical weight of their stares pressing into my skin. The string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing their bows, hovering awkwardly over their cellos and violins. The catering staff stood perfectly rigid against the silk wallpaper, holding heavy silver trays of caviar and roasted fig appetizers that no one was ever going to eat tonight. Every wealthy socialite, every rival real estate developer, and every gossiping neighbor was leaning forward in their velvet-upholstered chairs. They were all waiting for the explosion. They wanted the spectacle. High society has a very specific unspoken script written for women my age when they are publicly discarded by a powerful husband. I was supposed to shatter into a million pieces. I was supposed to let out a guttural sob, knock over my crystal water goblet, and beg Richard to remember our history. I was supposed to look across the room at his 26-year-old mistress Chloe and scream obscenities while my expensive makeup ran down my face. That is exactly the performance Richard had banked on. He wanted me to look unhinged and desperate. A hysterical wife makes it so much easier for a wealthy man to justify his cruel midlife exit strategy to his board of directors. He needed me to play the crazy aging woman so he could confidently play the misunderstood genius stepping into his vibrant new future. But Richard fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had been sleeping next to for 3 decades. While he spent the last 25 years polishing his ego on private golf courses and taking public credit for the commercial real estate empire we built together, I had been the one managing the actual foundation. I knew where every single dollar was buried. I knew the exact corporate structures of the offshore holding companies. I knew the fragile financial covenants on his massive commercial bank loans. As I sat there looking at the thick manila envelope containing my eviction notice and my divorce papers, the initial shock completely evaporated from my bloodstream. It was replaced by a dangerous, thrilling, and icy clarity. I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a financial sniper who had just been given the green light to take the shot. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap. They were not shaking. My breathing was perfectly even. I reached out and picked up my heavy linen napkin. I moved with slow, deliberate grace, completely ignoring the frantic, impatient energy radiating from Richard. I dabbed the corners of my mouth, folded the napkin perfectly in half, and laid it neatly beside the legal documents that were supposed to end my life. Then I reached for my glass of vintage Cabernet. The deep red liquid caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above us. I brought the glass to my lips and took a long, appreciative sip, letting the rich oak flavor settle on my tongue. It tasted remarkably like victory. I set the glass down squarely on the silver coaster. The soft clink of the crystal meeting the metal echoed loudly in the dead silent room. I placed my hands flat on the table and stood up. I smoothed the front of my vintage navy blue silk gown. I did not look at my ungrateful son Brandon, who was still staring at his phone waiting for his seed funding. I did not look at my selfish daughter Olivia, who was visibly trembling with embarrassment over her social media image. I did not even look at Marcus, my brilliant son-in-law, who was watching me with a mixture of deep sorrow and intense respect. I locked my eyes exclusively on Richard. He was standing near the head of the table, his chest puffed out in his custom Italian suit, still waiting for my tearful surrender. But when he saw my face, his smug smile faltered. The arrogant gleam in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden microscopic flash of absolute confusion. I did not look defeated. I looked incredibly powerful. I smiled at him. It was not a sad smile or a bitter smile. It was the radiant, predatory smile of a woman who knows she holds the winning lottery ticket and the detonator to a bomb at the exact same time. "Perfect timing, Richard," I said. My voice was not loud, but the flawless acoustic design of the ballroom carried my words crisp and clear to every single table in the vicinity. I saw Chloe stiffen in her chair by the terrace doors, her mocking smirk finally vanishing as she realized I was not going to cry. Richard blinked, his jaw tightening as he tried to process my completely calm demeanor. I picked up my designer clutch from the back of my chair. I took one step closer to him, closing the physical distance between us so he could see the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. I leaned in slightly. "Just do me one favor," I continued, my tone dropping into a smooth, businesslike cadence that I used to use when I negotiated our early banking contracts decades ago. "Make sure you change the master passwords to the company cybersecurity system by tomorrow morning. I would hate for anything terrible to happen to your precious digital infrastructure while you are busy packing my bags." I did not wait for his response. I did not need to. I saw the immediate, terrifying realization wash over his face. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale, sick, and suddenly very old. In that singular moment, Richard remembered exactly who had built the entire digital and financial architecture of his company. He remembered that I was not just a housewife who picked out curtains. I was the architect of his entire reality. I turned my back on him. I did not look back. I walked away from the table with my head held high and my posture impeccable. As I moved toward the grand double doors of the ballroom, the crowd of wealthy onlookers physically parted for me. They stepped back, giving me a wide berth, their eyes wide with shock and a sudden undeniable reverence. The whispers erupted behind me like a swarm of angry bees, but I tuned them out entirely. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp Connecticut night air. The valet immediately rushed forward to retrieve my car, his eyes wide as he handed me the keys. I tipped him generously and got into the driver's seat. I took a deep breath of the autumn air. It smelled like pure freedom. Richard thought he had just fired me from my job as his wife. He had no idea he had just officially accepted a new position as my ultimate victim. My drive back to the $5 million estate was peaceful. I had exactly 48 hours to pack my personal belongings, but I only needed 10 minutes to log into my laptop and activate the blind corporate trusts I had established a decade ago. The war had officially begun, and I had already won. The morning sun broke over the Connecticut coastline, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Westport. I had not slept a single wink. Instead, I had spent the night quietly packing 2 vintage leather suitcases with only my most personal items. I left the expensive diamond jewelry Richard had bought me. I left the designer gowns he liked to parade me around in. I only took what was truly mine. By 7 in the morning, I was sitting behind the wheel of my car driving away from the $5 million estate I had personally decorated. The crisp autumn air bit through my cashmere sweater, but I felt entirely awake. I needed to regroup. I needed caffeine before I could initiate the legal strikes I had meticulously planned. I pulled into the parking lot of an upscale artisanal cafe downtown. It was the kind of place where local corporate executives and wealthy wives bought $12 lattes before heading to the country club. I walked in, ordered my usual black espresso, and reached into my designer purse. I pulled out the heavy metal corporate black card. It was a card tied directly to the executive expense account of the real estate firm. I handed it to the young barista with a polite, easy smile. The barista swiped the thick metal card through the electronic reader. The machine let out a sharp, ugly buzzing sound. The small digital screen flashed bright red. The barista frowned, looking confused, and tried inserting the gold chip directly. Another harsh buzz echoed over the counter. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the young man said, looking deeply uncomfortable and refusing to meet my eyes. "It says the card is declined." I felt a brief prickle of irritation, but I kept my face perfectly smooth. I assumed it was a simple fraud alert triggered by an early morning coffee purchase. I reached back into my wallet and retrieved my personal platinum credit card. "Try this one," I said smoothly. He tapped it against the reader. "Declined." The word glowed on the screen like a neon warning sign. A woman standing in line behind me shifted her weight impatiently, letting out a soft, theatrical sigh. The subtle public humiliation was entirely intentional on Richard's part. He wanted me to feel small. I calmly opened the cash compartment of my wallet, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and handed it to the barista. "Keep the change," I said. I took my espresso and walked out of the cafe with my dignity completely intact. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, holding the warm paper cup. The situation was escalating much faster than I had anticipated. Richard was not just filing for divorce in a public humiliating spectacle. He was actively initiating a financial siege. He was trying to bleed me out by cutting off my access to our shared capital. I picked up my smartphone and opened a travel booking application. I needed a secure, comfortable place to stay for the next few days while my legal team mobilized in the city. I selected a premium penthouse suite at a luxury hotel in downtown Manhattan. I clicked Confirm Reservation. A notification popped up instantly on my screen. "Payment failed. Please contact your banking institution." Richard had actually done it. He had completely frozen the account, stripped my access, and locked me out of the financial ecosystem I had spent my entire adult life building alongside him. He truly believed that a woman without a credit card was a woman without power. He thought I was just a dependent housewife who would come crawling back to him the second I could not afford my luxurious lifestyle. I took a deep breath of the cold morning air, dialed the customer service number on the back of the heavy black card, and entered my elite concierge PIN. The automated system routed me immediately to a human representative. "Thank you for calling Premium Wealth Services," a bright, overly cheerful voice answered. "My name is Jessica. How can I assist you today?" "Jessica," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and remarkably steady. "My name is Victoria Sterling. Every single credit and debit account tied to my name has been suspended overnight. I need the holds lifted immediately." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard. "Ms. Sterling," the representative said, her cheerful tone instantly replaced by a rigid, rehearsed corporate script. "I am looking at the account profile now. It appears the primary account holder, Mr. Richard Sterling, authorized a complete freeze on all secondary cards and joint accounts at 3 o'clock this morning. I am afraid I cannot lift the financial restriction without his direct verbal authorization. You will need to speak with your husband to resolve this matter." My grip on the leather steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. "Listen to me very carefully, young lady," I growled, letting my icy fury bleed into my words. "I do not need Richard Sterling verbal permission to access my own money. I am not a dependent secondary holder. I am the foundational architect of that corporate account. I am the person who personally set up the cryptographic encryption system for that exact black card 25 years ago, when this commercial real estate empire was nothing more than a leaky garage and a pile of unpaid invoices. I wrote the compliance protocols your bank relies on today. So you are going to escalate this call to your regional vice president immediately, or I am going to report your branch for unauthorized financial withholding." I heard Jessica gasp softly on the other end of the line. The patronizing customer service attitude vanished entirely. "Please hold, Ms. Sterling," she stammered in absolute panic. "Let me get my senior supervisor on the line right now." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. There was no point in arguing with a terrified bank teller. The money in those standard accounts was completely irrelevant to me now anyway. Richard thought he had delivered a lethal, crippling blow. He thought he had severed my lifeline and left me to drown. He wanted me to panic, to feel completely impoverished, and to realize how desperately I needed his generosity to survive the week. He wanted me to call him begging for grocery money while he sat at breakfast with his 26-year-old mistress. But Richard was playing checkers, while I had been playing chess for the last decade. He had frozen the superficial surface accounts completely blind to the fact that the vast majority of our true wealth was quietly sitting in offshore trust funds that he did not even know existed. I took a sip of my black espresso. The bitter taste woke me up completely. Richard wanted to play a ruthless game of financial starvation. I smiled, a cold and predatory expression reflecting in the rearview mirror. I was going to let him think he was starving me right up until the exact moment I bought the entire restaurant and kicked him out onto the street. I drove my car back up the long, winding driveway of the Westport estate. The sprawling colonial mansion stood proudly against the crisp autumn sky. I had personally overseen the construction of this house 20 years ago. I chose the imported Italian marble for the foyer. I negotiated with the contractors. I planted the rose bushes lining the stone pathway. Richard had simply signed the checks and taken the credit at dinner parties. Now parked directly in front of the grand oak double doors was a massive commercial moving truck. 2 luxury sports cars were idling near the garage. Richard had promised I had 48 hours to pack my personal belongings. It had not even been 12 hours since the public humiliation at the country club, and he was already authorizing an invasion of my sanctuary. I parked my car, took a slow and deliberate breath, and walked through the front door. The inside of my home looked like a chaotic war zone. A team of men in matching gray uniforms were carrying heavy cardboard boxes through the hallways. Standing in the center of the grand foyer, holding a silver clipboard and an iced latte, was Chloe. She was wearing a tight cashmere sweater and designer leggings, looking less like a serious corporate director and more like a wealthy college student playing house. Next to her stood a flamboyant interior designer, waving his hands dramatically toward the sweeping staircase. I stopped in the doorway and watched in absolute silence as 2 workers brought out a massive stepladder. They positioned it directly beneath the enormous custom-painted family portrait that had hung on the wall for a decade. It was a beautiful oil painting commissioned when Brandon and Olivia were still teenagers. Chloe pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my family portrait. "Take that hideous thing down," she instructed the workers, her voice echoing loudly off the marble floors. "Be careful with the custom frame. We can reuse the wood, but burn the actual canvas. The color palette completely clashes with my new minimalist aesthetic. We are bringing in modern art this afternoon." I stepped further into the foyer. My heels clicked sharply against the marble. Chloe snapped her head in my direction. For a fraction of a second, she looked startled, like a burglar caught stealing silver. But the surprise quickly melted into a venomous, triumphant smirk. She took a step toward me, crossing her arms defensively. "Victoria," Chloe said, dripping with fake sweetness. "Richard said you were staying at a hotel in the city. He gave me the green light to start the renovation process this morning. I hope you do not mind. This place feels incredibly dated. It practically smells like an antique shop. Richard deserves a fresh, vibrant space that reflects his new energy." I looked at the workers who were currently prying the heavy gold frame off the wall. The painting of my children and my husband wobbled dangerously before coming loose. It was a visual execution of my entire past. Any other woman would have screamed. Any other mother would have thrown herself in front of the workers and demanded they stop destroying her memories. I simply tilted my head and looked at Chloe with absolute pity. She was so desperate to erase my ghost that she was completely blind to her own temporary status. "Do whatever you like with the canvas, Chloe," I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of the hysterical anger she so desperately wanted to provoke. "It is just paint and canvas. You can throw away the pictures, and you can buy new furniture with my husband's credit cards, but you can never erase the fact that you are living in a house built entirely on my foundation. Enjoy the minimalist aesthetic while it lasts." Chloe narrowed her eyes, clearly frustrated that I was not breaking down into tears. I walked past her, ignoring the interior designer who was staring at me with wide eyes, and began ascending the grand staircase. I needed to get to the master bedroom to finish packing my vintage leather suitcases. Every step I took echoed with the hollow reality of what my family had become. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the long hallway. I entered the master bedroom. It was already completely stripped of my personal touches. My expensive silk sheets were gone, replaced by cold white luxury hotel bedding. My vanity had been cleared of my perfumes. I walked over to the walk-in closet and began pulling my tailored suits and silk blouses off the wooden hangers. As I was neatly folding a cashmere coat into my suitcase, my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the marble vanity. I looked at the screen. It was a video call from my daughter, Olivia. I took a deep breath, hoping against all reason that my 28-year-old daughter was calling to apologize for her horrific behavior at the country club the night before. I hoped she had woken up, realized the gravity of her father tearing our family apart, and wanted to check on her mother. I swiped the screen to answer and placed the phone on speaker. "Hello, Olivia," I said quietly. "Mom, thank God you answered," Olivia said. Her voice was rushed, breathless, and completely devoid of any genuine warmth or concern. "Listen, I am at a brand fitting right now, so I cannot talk long, but we need to discuss the upcoming holidays. Thanksgiving is in 3 weeks, and Dad is finalizing the guest list for the catered dinner at the estate." I stopped folding my coat. My hands hovered over the open suitcase. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. For 30 years, I was the one who woke up at dawn to prepare the traditional turkey. I was the one who baked the pies from scratch. I was the one who painstakingly decorated the long dining table to make sure our family felt connected and loved. "What about the guest list, Olivia?" I asked, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "Well," Olivia stammered slightly, suddenly sounding defensive, "Dad is bringing Chloe, obviously. And Chloe has been talking to her therapist this morning. She is dealing with a lot of severe anxiety right now because of the transition. She feels like an outsider, and she really needs a supportive environment to integrate into the family dynamic." I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of the statement was almost physically dizzying. The 26-year-old mistress who was currently downstairs burning my family portraits was experiencing anxiety. "Get to the point, Olivia," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave into a tone of absolute authority. "Look, Mom, you coming to Thanksgiving is just going to make things incredibly awkward for everyone." Olivia blurted out quickly, like she was ripping off a bandage. Chloe is very sensitive to negative energy. If you are there, she is going to feel judged and uncomfortable. Dad really wants her to feel welcome, and honestly, so do I. She just got me an exclusive invite to a private Fashion Week after-party in New York. I cannot afford to ruin my relationship with her right now. So Dad and I think it is best if you just stay in the city for the holiday this year. Maybe you can order room service or go to a nice restaurant by yourself. We can do a quick video call before we cut the turkey. The silence stretched between us. It was a silence so profound and heavy that I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. My own daughter, the child I carried, the child I nurtured, the child I defended when she failed out of her first-choice university. She was uninviting me from my own family table. She was banishing her mother to eat a lonely hotel dinner on Thanksgiving just to appease a mistress who was offering her Fashion Week tickets. She was choosing a blue check mark on social media over the woman who gave her life. Mom, Olivia said, her voice dripping with irritation. "Are you there? Do not make a big emotional deal out of this, please. You have to be an adult about the divorce." I opened my eyes. The sadness was completely gone. The maternal instinct to protect my daughter vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating logic of a woman who was about to go to war. They had pushed me past the point of heartbreak. They had pushed me into a realm of absolute, unapologetic clarity. They wanted to strip me of my home, my finances, my history, and my family. They wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. They were treating me like a disposable stepping stone. I hear you perfectly. "Olivia," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, smooth as glass. "I will not be attending Thanksgiving. You do not need to worry about my negative energy ruining your new aesthetic." "Oh, thank God." Olivia sighed, clearly relieved that I was not yelling. "You are being so reasonable, Mom. I knew you would understand. It is just a dinner anyway. I will text you later to check in. I have to go. The stylist is waiting for me. Bye." The call disconnected. I stood alone in the master bedroom, staring at the blank screen of my cell phone. I did not shed a single tear. I picked up my phone and dropped it into my leather handbag. I zipped up my suitcase. The anger inside me was no longer a burning fire. It was a solid block of ice. I walked out of the master bedroom, pulling my vintage luggage behind me. I walked down the grand staircase. Chloe was still standing in the foyer, pointing at paint swatches with her designer. She did not even bother to look at me as I walked out the front door. I loaded my suitcases into the trunk of my car. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Marcus, my brilliant son-in-law. He was the only person who had tried to defend me at the country club. The message was brief and urgent. "Meet me at the underground parking garage of the downtown library in 30 minutes. Bring your old encrypted laptop. Richard is making a massive financial move today, and I think you need to see the compliance files before he destroys everything." I read the message twice. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. They thought they had successfully evicted me. They thought they had chased me away with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. They had absolutely no idea that I was driving straight to the ammunition depot. The time for crying was over. It was time to pull the trigger. The downtown library parking garage was a damp concrete cavern. It smelled intensely of motor oil and old rain. I navigated my luxury sedan down to the 3rd subterranean level, just as Marcus had instructed in his text message. There were no security cameras down here. It was a cold, empty space, hidden far beneath the bustling streets of the city, making it the perfect location for corporate espionage. I drove slowly past rows of concrete pillars until I saw him standing under a flickering fluorescent light. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man who usually carried himself with immense pride and an undeniable corporate authority. Today, however, he looked completely exhausted. He was wearing the exact same charcoal gray suit he had worn to the country club the night before. His expensive silk tie was pulled loose around his neck, and he was clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest, like a physical shield against the world. I pulled my car into the empty space next to him and unlocked the passenger door. Marcus slid into the leather seat. He did not say hello. He closed the door heavily and just sat there for a long moment, staring straight ahead at the blank concrete wall. A thick, heavy silence filled the cabin of the car. "Victoria." He finally began, his deep voice thick with sleep deprivation and lingering shame. "I need to apologize for last night. I should have stood up for you. I should have pushed Olivia aside and knocked Richard out right there in the middle of the ballroom. I feel like an absolute coward for sitting back down." I reached over the center console and placed my hand gently on his arm. He was the only person in my entire family who actually possessed a functioning moral compass. "Do not ever apologize for surviving in a snake pit, Marcus," I said softly. "You are a good, honorable man, married to a very lost and very selfish young woman. You have a demanding career to protect and a difficult life to navigate. I do not need a knight in shining armor to rescue me from Richard. What I need is a chief compliance officer who knows exactly how to read the fine print. Tell me what you found." Marcus let out a heavy breath and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents marked with highly confidential red stamps. His hands were actually shaking slightly as he placed the heavy file on the center console between us. "Richard has completely lost his mind, Victoria," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "He is moving with a level of financial recklessness that I have never seen in my entire career in corporate law. He is trying to liquidate assets at lightning speed to fund this insane new lifestyle with Chloe. But the parent company accounts do not have the massive amount of liquid cash he needs right now. Most of our capital is tied up in long-term commercial development phases, so he is intentionally bypassing the board of directors, and he is aggressively bypassing my compliance department. He is going straight for the crown jewel of the empire. He is leveraging the apex tower." I felt a sharp, thrilling jolt run down my spine, but I kept my face entirely impassive. The Apex Tower was the largest and most prestigious commercial real estate project in the history of Richard Firm. It was a massive, beautiful glass and steel skyscraper located right in the center of the financial district. It was fully leased to top-tier corporate tenants and generated millions of dollars in steady monthly revenue. It was the absolute bedrock of Richard's entire wealth. "He is mortgaging the tower?" I asked, keeping my tone strictly analytical and detached. "For what exactly?" Marcus let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "He is taking out a massive high-yield loan against the property. He needs liquid capital immediately because Chloe has convinced him that they absolutely need a custom luxury superyacht for their upcoming wedding in Saint-Tropez next summer. On top of that, your son Brandon has been relentlessly harassing him for a $2 million cash injection to save his failing tech startup. Richard is literally betting the entire commercial real estate company on a party boat and a useless smartphone application." I leaned back in my leather seat and looked at the concrete ceiling. The sheer breathtaking scale of Richard's stupidity was almost beautiful to witness. A man blinded by a midlife crisis and desperate to impress a 26-year-old mistress is a man who will gladly walk himself right off a financial cliff. "Who is underwriting the loan?" I asked him. No traditional American bank would ever approve a commercial real estate mortgage just so the CEO could buy a personal luxury watercraft. The federal compliance flags would shut the entire application down in 24 hours. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, tapping his index finger aggressively against the stack of corporate papers. "Exactly. That is exactly why he is not using a traditional domestic bank. He found a private offshore trust fund. They operate strictly out of the Cayman Islands. They are a shadow financial entity that specializes in high-risk corporate debt and predatory lending. They approved his massive loan application in less than 12 hours without asking a single question about how he intends to use the disbursed funds." Marcus picked up the thick contract and flipped rapidly to the very last page. "But the terms are absolutely predatory, Victoria. I stayed up all night reading every single line of this contract. It is a literal death trap. There is a very specific and very aggressive financial covenant buried deep in the fine print. If Richard transfers the loan disbursement out of the commercial operating account and moves it into a personal account to buy that yacht, he will immediately trigger a catastrophic default clause. The trust will not just demand their money back. The contract legally stipulates that the trust will have the immediate right to seize the collateral. They will take the Apex Tower. They will take the physical building, the land underneath it, and all the lucrative leasing contracts. It is total financial suicide. I tried to warn him in his office this morning, but he completely shut me down. He told me I was just a paranoid compliance officer and that he was the visionary genius of the family. He is signing the final paperwork tomorrow afternoon. I looked down at the documents resting on the console between us. I did not need to read the fine print. I already knew exactly what the default clause said. I knew every single terrifying legal word in that contract because I was the one who personally drafted it 10 years ago. I looked at the name of the lending entity printed boldly at the top of the title page, V Trust, Victoria Trust. Marcus was staring at me, waiting for me to panic. He was waiting for me to break down and cry over the impending destruction of the family business. He truly thought he was delivering the tragic news that Richard was about to lose everything we had built to a group of ruthless, anonymous foreign investors. He thought I would be devastated to see my legacy destroyed by a superyacht. I reached out and gently closed the manila folder. I picked up my black espresso from the cup holder and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast tasted incredibly sweet. I turned to look at my brilliant, terrified son-in-law. A warm, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I had worn in weeks. "Marcus, you are the best compliance officer this state has ever seen," I said smoothly. "Your attention to detail is truly unmatched, but you need to stop worrying about Richard. Richard has made his bed, and now he is going to have to sleep in it, even if that bed is located on a very expensive and very temporary boat." Marcus stared at me, his forehead wrinkled in absolute confusion. "Victoria, do you not understand what I am telling you?" he pleaded, his voice rising slightly in panic. "He is going to lose the tower. He is going to bankrupt the parent company. If he signs this contract tomorrow, the entire empire is gone." I placed my hand firmly over his to calm his shaking fingers. "I understand perfectly, Marcus. In fact, I understand the financial situation far better than my arrogant husband ever could. I want you to go home tonight. I want you to pack up your home office. I want you to open your laptop and type out a formal letter of resignation. I want you to submit it to Human Resources the very second they open their doors tomorrow morning. You need to sever all professional ties with Richard Sterling before the close of business tomorrow." Marcus blinked, his dark eyes widening as he intensely searched my face. He was a highly intelligent man. He had grown up surviving by his wits and observing the hidden power dynamics in rooms full of wealthy people. He looked at my completely calm demeanor. He looked at the confident, elegant way I held myself, despite losing my home and my marriage in the same 24-hour period. He looked down at the folder that clearly stated the offshore lender was named V Trust. I saw the exact second the realization hit his brilliant mind. The air left his lungs in a sharp, sudden exhale. He slumped back against the leather passenger seat, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what he had just uncovered. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the car engine. "It is you. You are the Shadow Trust." I did not confirm or deny his statement. I simply maintained my calm, radiant smile. I looked straight ahead at the concrete wall of the parking garage, focusing on the future. "Go home, Marcus," I said softly, but with absolute authority. "Protect yourself. Protect your own future and your own career. Leave Olivia if she refuses to walk away from her father and his toxic money. Because by this time, next week, Richard Sterling is not going to have a single dime to his name, and I have a very important meeting with my legal team in Manhattan." I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. Marcus stepped out of the car, moving slowly like a man walking in a vivid dream. He closed the car door quietly, staring at me through the tinted glass with a look of profound, absolute respect. I put the car in drive and accelerated out of the dark underground garage, heading straight into the bright, blinding light of the city. The trap was perfectly set. Now all I had to do was wait for my greedy, arrogant husband to step inside and pull the lever all by himself. I looked at Marcus one last time. His wide eyes reflected the dim fluorescent lights of the parking garage. The sheer magnitude of my financial trap had finally clicked in his brilliant mind. He knew exactly what V-Trust stood for. He knew that Richard was walking blindly into a legal slaughterhouse of his own making. I kept my hands perfectly relaxed on the leather steering wheel. "Marcus," I said softly but with absolute finality, "you are the smartest man in that entire corporate building. Do not let my arrogant husband drag you down with his rapidly sinking ship. Go back to the office right now. Pack up your desk, type up your formal resignation letter, and hand it directly to Human Resources. Do not wait for Friday. Do not wait for Olivia to give you permission. Protect your own future because by this time next week, Richard Sterling will not even own the expensive Italian shoes on his feet." Marcus swallowed hard. The conflict in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a profound and absolute loyalty. He gave me a slow and deeply respectful nod. It was the clear gesture of a man acknowledging a queen who had just ruthlessly reclaimed her throne. He opened the heavy car door and stepped out into the damp concrete cavern. I put my luxury sedan into drive and accelerated up the steep concrete ramp. I left the dark underground garage behind and drove straight into the blinding golden sunlight of a crisp Manhattan afternoon. I felt lighter than I had in 3 decades. Richard thought he had stripped me of my identity by freezing a few superficial bank accounts. He had no idea he had simply removed the very last chain holding me back. I navigated through the dense, aggressive city traffic until I reached an imposing glass and steel skyscraper located in the most expensive financial district in the world. I handed my car keys to the private valet and walked into the grand marble lobby. My vintage navy blue silk dress moved gracefully with every confident step. I bypassed the main security desk entirely. I stepped directly into the private executive elevator and pressed the glowing button for the penthouse floor. The heavy steel doors slid shut, securing my rapid ascent to the top. When the elevator softly chimed and opened, I stepped out into the sleek, silent reception area of the most ruthless and feared corporate law firm on the eastern seaboard. The receptionist, sitting behind a massive slab of imported black granite, immediately sat up straight. She recognized me immediately. She did not see the discarded aging wife of a real estate developer. She saw the shadow billionaire who quietly paid their massive monthly retainer fees. "Good afternoon, Ms. Sterling," the receptionist said, her voice hushed with deep professional reverence. "Your senior legal team is already waiting for you in the primary glass conference room. They have the offshore trust documents prepared." I did not stop walking. I simply offered her a brief, elegant smile. The chessboard was completely set. The enemy pieces were locked hopelessly into place. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the conference room, ready to legally burn my husband empire straight to the ground. The glass conference room at the very top of the Manhattan skyscraper was a sanctuary of absolute power. It did not smell like the cheap imported lilies Richard used to impress his country club friends. It smelled of polished mahogany, cold air conditioning, and the sharp, crisp scent of freshly printed legal documents. I walked to the head of the massive obsidian table and took my seat. The leather chair was heavy and perfectly contoured, a stark contrast to the fragile velvet chairs I was expected to sit in at high society dinners. Across from me sat Sarah. She was a 45-year-old senior partner at the firm, and easily the most terrifying corporate litigator in the entire state of New York. Sarah did not wear bright colors or soft fabrics. She wore a tailored black suit that looked like modern armor. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe knot, and her eyes held the kind of ruthless intelligence that made corrupt chief executive officers sweat through their expensive shirts. She was not just my attorney. Over the last decade, she had become my most trusted confidant and the primary architect of my impending revenge. Sarah did not offer me pity. She knew I did not want it. Instead, she slid a thick black leather binder across the smooth surface of the table. The binder stopped exactly 1 inch from my fingertips. She leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers, looking at me with a microscopic glint of amusement in her cold eyes. "I received the notification this morning," Victoria Sarah said, her voice smooth and deliberately paced. "Richard officially froze the secondary credit lines tied to the commercial accounts. He also locked you out of the primary checking accounts. I assume he gave you a ridiculously short time frame to vacate the Westport estate as well." I rested my hands on the black binder and smiled a genuinely warm smile. "He gave me 48 hours, I replied, keeping my tone conversational. And he had his 26-year-old communications director bring an interior designer to the house before I even had a chance to pack my vintage coats. They are currently burning the family portraits to make room for a minimalist aesthetic. He truly believes he has left me entirely destitute, Sarah. He thinks I'm going to be begging for a monthly alimony check just to survive the winter." Sarah let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the soundproof glass walls. It was a beautiful sound. "Men like Richard Sterling are entirely predictable," Sarah said, shaking her head in mild disgust. "They build their entire identities on the foundation of a woman's silent labor, and the second they achieve a certain tax bracket, they convince themselves they built the empire entirely alone. He thinks he is starving you out. He has absolutely no idea that he just locked the front door of a burning building while you are standing outside holding the only fire extinguisher. Open the binder, Victoria. Let us review the exact dimensions of your kingdom." I opened the heavy leather cover. The pages inside were not divorce papers or alimony requests. They were the highly classified internal financial ledgers of Richard Commercial Real Estate Empire alongside the private structural documents of an offshore entity known as V Trust. Looking at these documents always transported me back to the darkest year of my marriage. It was the fall of 2008. The global financial markets were collapsing, and the American real estate sector was burning to the ground. Richard Company was not the massive, untouchable empire it is today. It was a heavily over-leveraged house of cards built on toxic subprime loans and arrogant expansion projects. I remember walking into our master bathroom one night and finding Richard sitting on the cold marble floor. He was weeping uncontrollably, clutching a bottle of scotch. He told me he was going to lose everything. The banks were calling in his loans. His investors were fleeing. He was 40 hours away from filing for complete and total bankruptcy. He begged me to forgive him for destroying our future. Any normal wife would have simply held him and prepared to sell the house. But I was not a normal wife. I was a former Wall Street risk analyst. I knew the math, and I knew how to navigate the shadows of corporate finance. What Richard did not know, and what I had meticulously hidden from him for my entire adult life, was that my maternal grandfather had left me a massive private inheritance. It was a generational wealth trust completely legally insulated from my marriage and entirely under my exclusive control. The money was sitting in a private account, accumulating interest, waiting for an emergency. 2008 was that emergency. I could have simply written Richard a check. I could have transferred the millions of dollars directly into his failing company to save his precious ego. But I knew my husband. I knew that if I gave him the money directly, he would eventually resent me for seeing him at his weakest. Worse, he would eventually convince himself that his own brilliant business acumen had saved the company, not his wife's secret inheritance. He would use my money to rebuild his throne, and then he would eventually push me off the side. So I made a much more calculated decision. I decided to save his life, but I also decided to own his soul. I contacted Sarah, who was just a junior partner at the time. Together, we established a highly secure blind trust headquartered in the Cayman Islands. We named it V Trust. Using my hidden maternal inheritance, V Trust aggressively bought up every single piece of Richard's toxic debt. We bought his outstanding commercial mortgages from the panicked national banks for pennies on the dollar. We bought his high-yield corporate bonds. We became the anonymous shadow entity holding the absolute maximum leverage over his entire operation. When Richard received the notice that a foreign investment group had purchased his debt and restructured his loans to keep him out of bankruptcy, he celebrated for a week. He thought he was a genius who had miraculously charmed international investors. He never once suspected that the ruthless foreign investor was the woman quietly making him dinner in his own kitchen. Sarah tapped a silver pen against the financial ledger, bringing me back to the present moment. "Let us look at the current distribution of power," Sarah instructed, pointing to a heavily highlighted pie chart on the third page. Richard Sterling believes he is the majority shareholder of the parent company because he owns 60% of the voting stock. But equity is completely meaningless when the debt-to-income ratio is manipulated. Through V-Trust, you currently hold 65% of the total corporate debt structure. You hold the primary mortgages on his top 4 performing assets. You hold the operational credit lines that make his daily payroll possible. He is the chief executive officer in name only. You are the actual Bank Victoria. You are the silent landlord of his entire pathetic reality. I traced my finger over the bold numbers on the page. The sheer scale of my hidden power was intoxicating. Richard had spent the last 15 years walking around the state of Connecticut, acting like a self-made titan of industry. He bought expensive Italian suits. He bought luxury sports cars. He hired young, beautiful women like Chloe to stroke his fragile ego. And every single time he swiped a corporate credit card, he was technically borrowing money from me. I had allowed him to play king because it kept the family stable. It kept Brandon and Olivia in expensive private schools, and it kept the peace in our home. But the peace was officially broken. The king had decided to banish the queen without realizing she owned the entire chessboard. And now he is about to hand us the final piece of the puzzle, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Marcus told me this morning that Richard is desperately trying to liquidate assets to buy a custom superyacht for his new mistress. He is actively bypassing his own board of directors to mortgage the Apex Tower. Sarah smiled a sharp, terrifying smile that showed all of her teeth. Her eyes gleamed with the pure thrill of impending corporate slaughter. "That is exactly why I called you in today, Victoria," she said, leaning forward and sliding a separate single sheet of paper toward me. "This is the loan application Richard submitted to our offshore intermediaries yesterday afternoon. He is requesting a massive cash injection against the full appraised value of the Apex Tower. He thinks he is outsmarting the American banking system by using his favorite shadow lender in the Caymans. He has absolutely no idea that he is asking his discarded wife to finance his wedding yacht." I looked at the signature line on the document. Richard had already signed his name in bold, arrogant black ink. He was so desperate for cash to impress Chloe that he had completely ignored the standard compliance reviews. He was rushing blindly into the dark. "We are going to approve the loan immediately," Sarah said, her voice vibrating with intense anticipation. "I have already instructed the offshore managers to wire the funds into his primary commercial operating account by tomorrow morning. But as you know, the master contract contains a highly aggressive financial covenant. The money is legally earmarked strictly for commercial development. If Richard transfers even a single dollar of that loan out of the corporate account and into a personal account to buy that yacht, he will immediately trigger the default clause." I looked up at Sarah, feeling the icy resolve settle permanently into my bones. The trap was flawless. Richard greed and his desperate need to impress a woman 30 years his junior were going to be his exact undoing. "Once he breaches the covenant," I said calmly, "what is the exact timeline for asset seizure?" Sarah leaned back and crossed her arms, looking extremely satisfied. "According to the documents you personally drafted 10 years ago, Trust has the right to bypass standard mediation entirely. Upon a documented breach of covenant, we can legally seize the collateral within 24 hours. We take the Apex Tower. We take the land underneath it. We absorb all the lucrative tenant leases. Richard will be left with a massive tax liability and absolutely zero revenue to cover it. The parent company will implode in a matter of days. He will face federal investigation for fraudulent wealth transfer, and his precious new life will turn into a living nightmare." I slowly closed the heavy black leather binder. The soft thud of the cover echoed in the quiet conference room like a judge bringing down a gavel. My ungrateful children thought I was a burden. My arrogant husband thought I was a relic. They were all about to learn a very painful lesson about the invisible women who hold up their gilded worlds. "Approve the loan, Sarah," I commanded, my voice hard and entirely devoid of mercy. "Give him the rope. Let us see how quickly he decides to hang himself." While I sat in the silent, pristine conference room high above Manhattan, finalizing the legal framework of my revenge, my soon-to-be ex-husband and our children were busy digging their own graves. They were using golden shovels, but they were digging all the same. Because I still held the foundational cryptographic keys to the parent company's servers, I had complete and unrestricted access to the real-time transaction ledgers. I sat on the plush white sofa of my hotel penthouse, drinking a glass of sparkling water, and watching the digital financial alerts roll across my laptop screen like a beautiful and tragic comedy. Richard had promised Chloe a brand new life of unlimited luxury, and she was wasting absolutely no time cashing in that promise. At exactly 10 in the morning, the corporate black card was swiped at a high-end European furniture gallery in the downtown design district. Chloe dropped $150,000 in a single transaction on a custom marble dining table and a set of imported Italian leather sofas to replace the expensive antiques she was currently throwing into a dumpster at my former estate. 2 hours later, another alert flashed across my screen. $35,000 at a luxury jewelry boutique on Fifth Avenue. She was likely purchasing a diamond tennis bracelet to soothe the severe emotional anxiety she claimed to be suffering from. But my children were certainly not going to let the young mistress have all the fun. Brandon, my visionary 32-year-old son, successfully processed a massive wire transfer for $2 million directly from his father executive slush fund. He immediately funneled the money into the bloated operating account of his doomed technology startup. Sitting alone in my penthouse, I could see the exact itemized breakdown of his ridiculous business expenses. He was not hiring brilliant software engineers or developing actual products. He was signing a commercial lease for a massive, useless office space in downtown Brooklyn, completely equipped with a kombucha tap on the wall and a private organic chef in the kitchen. He was aggressively buying the pure illusion of success because he possessed absolutely no actual talent. And Olivia, my sweet 28-year-old influencer daughter, was frantically swiping her secondary platinum card all over the city before her father realized just how much capital she was draining. She charged $40,000 in a single afternoon, buying custom designer gowns, imported handbags, and luxury skincare products to prepare for her highly exclusive Fashion Week parties. They were acting like desperate lottery winners who had completely lost their minds. They were happily feasting on the decaying carcass of my 30-year marriage, and they did not care who was ultimately paying the bill as long as the expensive champagne kept flowing freely. The absolute peak of their foolish pride, however, was happening concurrently inside the executive boardroom of Richard Commercial Real Estate Firm. My attorney Sarah had a senior paralegal physically present in the building, delivering the final offshore loan documents. According to the detailed messages the paralegal was sending me, Richard was holding court in the conference room like a conquering Roman emperor. He was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table, wearing a brand-new custom-tailored suit that hid his expanding waistline. Chloe was sitting right next to him, draped in her new diamonds, looking incredibly bored by the complex legal jargon, but highly interested in the final dollar amount printed on the contract. Marcus, my brilliant son-in-law, had already submitted his formal resignation letter that morning and walked out of the building just as I had instructed him to do. With the only voice of strict compliance and actual reason completely gone, Richard was now completely surrounded by a room full of spineless yes-men and terrified junior executives who were too afraid to question the chief executive officer. Richard slapped his heavy hand against the thick stack of papers resting on the table. He actually laughed out loud and bragged to his junior staff about his unmatched financial brilliance. He proudly declared that traditional American banking institutions were far too slow and too heavily regulated for a true real estate visionary like himself. He boasted endlessly about finding a highly exclusive private offshore investment group located in the Cayman Islands called V Trust. He told his staff that these anonymous foreign billionaires were practically begging to give him their money because his property portfolio was so incredibly strong and his personal reputation was utterly flawless. He spoke with the absolute blind confidence of a man who has never once looked down to see that he is standing on a trapdoor. He had absolutely no idea that the wealthy foreign billionaires he was currently bragging about to his young mistress were actually just one 56-year-old woman who knew exactly how much sugar he took in his morning coffee. The offshore legal intermediaries representing V Trust had intentionally made the entire loan approval process seem incredibly easy and streamlined. They deliberately stroked his massive, fragile ego. They told him he was a real estate genius who deserved VIP treatment. They gave him a false sense of absolute security, so he would not bother to look too closely at the restrictive fine print buried in the contract. And Richard, being a man completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to impress a woman 30 years his junior, fell for the corporate flattery immediately. He picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. He did not ask his internal legal team to carefully review the restrictive financial covenants located on page 42. He did not question why an anonymous foreign trust was so incredibly willing to hand him tens of millions of dollars with a miraculous 24-hour turnaround time. He just desperately wanted the liquid cash so he could buy the custom luxury superyacht and prove to his new girlfriend that he was an unstoppable titan of industry. Richard pressed the gold nib of his expensive pen to the crisp white paper. With a few dramatic and sweeping strokes, he signed his bold signature on the dotted line. In doing so, he officially pledged the Apex Tower, the absolute crown jewel of his entire real estate empire, as direct physical collateral to V-Trust. He aggressively mortgaged the beautiful glass, the strong steel, the expansive marble lobby, and every single lucrative corporate tenant lease located inside the building. He handed the heavy keys to his entire kingdom directly to me with a wide, arrogant smile on his face. But signing the massive loan document was only the first half of my trap. The second half required him to willingly hang himself with the exact rope I had so generously provided. The paralegal collected the freshly signed documents and immediately initiated the massive international wire transfer. Within 30 minutes, the offshore funds hit Richard's primary corporate operating account. The money was legally restricted. It was explicitly and strictly earmarked for commercial property development and operational corporate payroll only. I sat alone in my hotel penthouse, staring intently at the blinking cursor on my secure banking dashboard. I was waiting patiently for him to make the final, fatal move. I knew he could not resist the temptation. He had promised Chloe a lavish wedding ceremony on the Mediterranean Sea, and Richard Sterling never, ever denied himself a shiny new toy. I took a slow, deep breath, watching the digital numbers on the screen. Suddenly, the numbers shifted violently. A massive deduction flashed across the corporate operating account in bright red font. Richard had just authorized an immediate outgoing wire transfer for $8 million. I quickly clicked on the transaction details to verify the recipient. The destination account belonged to a private luxury maritime brokerage firm based in Monaco. He actually did it. He took the legally restricted commercial loan funds and transferred them directly out of the secure corporate ecosystem to purchase a personal luxury watercraft. The invisible trap snapped shut with a resounding and violent finality. Richard had just flagrantly violated the core financial covenant of the V-Trust Master Lending Agreement. He had committed a textbook case of fraudulent wealth transfer in broad daylight. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Sarah's private direct line. She answered on the very first ring. I could hear the sharp anticipation in her breathing over the phone. "Did he actually do it?" she asked, her voice eager and strictly professional. I smiled, looking out at the sprawling, beautiful Manhattan skyline. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a dark, blood-red glow over the towering glass skyscrapers. "He bought the boat, Sarah," I replied smoothly, my voice completely void of any mercy or hesitation. "He breached the legal covenant exactly 5 minutes ago. I want you to initiate the total default protocol immediately. Do not wait for the sun to rise tomorrow morning. I want the immediate asset seizure documents filed with the federal court tonight. I want the Apex Tower entirely locked down, and I want Richard Sterling totally financially paralyzed before he even finishes eating his celebratory steak dinner." Sarah let out a low, dark chuckle that sounded like pure legal poetry. "Consider it done, Victoria," she said. "The king is officially dead. Long live the queen." I ended the phone call and gently closed the lid of my laptop. My ungrateful family had spent the last 48 hours treating my secret money like a limitless luxury buffet. Tomorrow morning they were finally going to choke on the bill. I did not attend the extravagant engagement party that my husband threw for his new mistress. It had barely been 48 hours since he slid those divorce papers across the table at the country club, but Richard was a man who moved with the reckless speed of a teenager in a stolen car. He rented out the entire top floor of a highly exclusive rooftop lounge in Manhattan for the evening. According to the precise reports I received from the private security firm I had quietly retained, he spared absolutely no expense. He was paying for premium imported champagne, rare caviar, and a live jazz band. He was aggressively celebrating his new freedom and his massive new offshore bank loan. He was entirely convinced that he was the undisputed king of the world, holding court among his wealthy sycophants and his terrified corporate employees. He wanted to show high society that discarding a 30-year marriage was as easy as changing a silk tie. Chloe was reportedly floating through the crowded room wearing a custom white silk dress that cost more than most people earn in an entire year. She was proudly displaying the massive diamond ring Richard had purchased with my secret corporate funds. My daughter Olivia was following closely behind her, taking endless photographs for her social media pages, desperately trying to leverage her father's new relationship into internet fame. My son Brandon was cornering wealthy guests near the open bar, aggressively pitching his doomed technology startup and bragging about the $2 million cash injection his father had just provided. They were a perfect portrait of absolute delusion. They were dancing and laughing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely blind to the massive iceberg tearing through the hull directly beneath their expensive designer shoes. But I was not going to let them celebrate my financial execution in total peace. I needed to send a very clear message. I wanted to look my husband in the eye without ever having to step foot in that room. Earlier that afternoon, I visited a highly exclusive private florist located on the Upper East Side. I did not order cheerful pink peonies or romantic white lilies. I ordered a massive, imposing arrangement of dark blood-red orchids, black baccarat roses, and sharp, twisting willow branches. It did not look like a wedding gift. It looked like a beautiful, violent warning. It was a floral representation of a bleeding empire. I instructed the florist to place the arrangement in a heavy black marble vase. I then handed them a thick black card made of premium stock paper. I paid a premium fee in cash to have a specialized private courier deliver the arrangement directly to the VIP section of the rooftop lounge exactly at the peak of the celebration. The courier arrived exactly at 9 in the evening, just as Richard was raising his glass to offer a toast to his beautiful new bride-to-be. The heavy glass doors of the lounge swung open, and two men in dark suits carried the massive black marble vase into the center of the room. The sheer size and the aggressive dark aesthetic of the floral arrangement immediately brought the entire party to a dead halt. The jazz band stopped playing. The wealthy guests stepped back, murmuring in confusion, as the men placed the heavy vase directly on the main table right next to the towering champagne fountain. Richard lowered his glass, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He hated anything that interrupted his carefully curated public image. Chloe stared at the dark red orchids with visible disgust wrinkling her perfectly contoured nose. She demanded to know who would send such a morbid and depressing gift to a glamorous engagement party. The head courier did not answer her. He simply stepped forward and handed the sealed black envelope directly to Richard before turning around and walking out of the room. The entire lounge was dead silent. Every single guest was watching. Richard tore open the black envelope with aggressive annoyance. He pulled out the thick card. Printed in sharp, elegant gold foil lettering was a single sentence. I had chosen the words very carefully. Every debt must be paid with the highest interest. Richard stared at the card for a long moment. I could easily imagine the gears slowly turning in his arrogant mind. He read the words again. And then he did exactly what I knew he would do. He completely missed the warning. Richard threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a forced, theatrical laugh, designed to show the room that he was entirely unbothered. He waved the heavy black card in the air for all his wealthy friends to see. "It is just Victoria," he announced, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "My poor, bitter ex-wife. She is sitting alone in a hotel room completely cut off from the bank accounts, and this is the best she can do. She spent her last few dollars sending us a dramatic flower arrangement because she cannot handle the reality that I have moved on to a better life. Let us raise a glass to the past, ladies and gentlemen. May she eventually find some peace." The room erupted in polite, sycophantic laughter. The guests eagerly raised their glasses and drank to his cruel joke. Chloe smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and kissed him on the cheek. Richard casually tossed the premium black card onto the table right next to the dark orchids. He grabbed Chloe by the waist and pulled her toward the dance floor, completely dismissing the greatest threat of his entire life. He thought I was throwing a pathetic emotional tantrum. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply issuing a formal legal receipt for his impending destruction. But there was one person in that crowded room who was not laughing. Marcus was standing quietly near the edge of the terrace, holding a glass of club soda. He had been dragged to the engagement party by Olivia, who threatened to make his life miserable if he did not show up and support her father. Marcus had spent the entire evening watching the lavish display of stolen wealth with intense physical nausea. He watched Richard authorize the massive yacht purchase that morning. He knew the money was legally restricted, and he knew exactly who was sitting on the other side of that offshore lending agreement. When Richard threw the black card onto the table, Marcus slowly walked over to the floral arrangement. The dark red orchids looked like fresh blood against the stark white tablecloth. He reached out and picked up the discarded black envelope. He slid the card out and read the gold foil lettering. Every debt must be paid with the highest interest. Marcus felt a sudden freezing chill run down his spine. He remembered the cold, damp parking garage. He remembered the absolute terrifying calm in my voice when I told him to go home and protect himself. He remembered the offshore documents explicitly naming V-Trust as the shadow entity holding the massive commercial mortgage on the Apex Tower. Marcus was a brilliant compliance officer. He did not see a bitter ex-wife sending a jealous message. He saw a highly calculated apex predator actively snapping the jaws of a lethal financial trap. He looked across the room at Richard, who was currently spinning Chloe around the dance floor, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just committed massive federal corporate fraud by wiring commercial loan funds to a luxury yacht broker. Marcus realized in that exact terrifying second that the entire real estate empire was going to collapse. It was not going to happen next year or next month. It was going to happen tomorrow morning. Victoria was not just going to take the company. She was going to obliterate the foundation, the walls, and the roof. Anyone standing inside the building when the legal wrecking ball hit was going to be completely destroyed by the falling debris. Marcus looked at his wife, Olivia. She was standing near the bar, laughing loudly with a group of young influencers completely obsessed with her own reflection in the mirror. She had chosen her father and his toxic money over her husband, loyalty. She had dug her own grave right next to her brother and her arrogant father. Marcus realized he could not save her. She would never listen to him anyway. Marcus did not say a single word to anyone. He placed the heavy black card back on the table next to the bleeding orchids. He set his glass of club soda down. He turned his back on the lavish engagement party and walked straight toward the exit. He stepped into the quiet elevator and rode it all the way down to the empty lobby. As he walked out into the cool Manhattan night air, he pulled his smartphone out of his tailored suit pocket. His hands were perfectly steady. He opened his secure corporate email application. He typed out a brief, formal, and completely irrevocable letter of immediate resignation. He explicitly cited severe ethical concerns regarding unauthorized executive financial transfers as his primary reason for leaving. He attached his digital signature and pressed send. The email went directly to the Human Resources Department and the external legal counsel of Richard Firm. Marcus walked down the dark city street, leaving the sinking ship far behind him. He had successfully saved himself from the absolute bloodbath that was about to unfold. Because when the sun came up the next morning, Richard Sterling was going to wake up and realize that the dark red flowers were not a joke. They were a funeral wreath for his entire pathetic life. I sat in the absolute silence of my Manhattan penthouse. The only light in the room came from the cold blue glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. While Richard was busy drinking vintage champagne and spinning his young mistress around a crowded dance floor, I was watching the digital heartbeat of his entire empire. I had a direct, secure connection to the primary corporate operating accounts. I did not blink. I did not want to miss the exact second my arrogant husband officially destroyed his own life. At exactly 11:15 in the evening, the system refreshed. A massive deposit materialized on the screen. The offshore loan from V-Trust had successfully cleared international customs and landed squarely in his commercial real estate account. It was tens of millions of dollars, legally earmarked exclusively for commercial development and operational payroll. For a very brief moment, Richard was technically the wealthiest he had ever been, but I knew the money would not stay there. A man desperate to prove his youth and his power to a 26-year-old girl cannot let cash sit idle in a checking account. He had promised her a luxury superyacht for their Mediterranean wedding, and he was far too arrogant to wait. I watched the digital ledger with the predatory patience of a hawk. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and then it happened. The screen flashed bright red. A massive outgoing wire transfer was suddenly initiated directly from the restricted commercial account. My eyes tracked the routing numbers. $8 million was moving at lightning speed out of the secure corporate ecosystem and hurtling straight toward a private luxury maritime brokerage firm based in Monaco. He had actually done it. Richard had taken commercial loan funds and flagrantly spent them on a personal watercraft. The trap did not just snap shut. It slammed closed with the devastating force of a steel vault. By transferring those funds to buy a boat, Richard had officially and irrevocably breached the core financial covenant of the V-Trust Master Lending Agreement. He had committed textbook fraudulent wealth transfer. He had legally forfeited his right to mediation. He had handed me the absolute right to seize the Apex Tower and liquidate his entire company. I opened a secure encrypted portal on my desktop. It was a direct digital link to Sarah and her team of ruthless corporate litigators. The emergency injunction files were already uploaded and waiting. The asset seizure documents were perfectly drafted. The federal freezing orders were primed and ready to be filed with the stroke of a single key. My husband thought he had left me with nothing but a broken heart and 2 vintage suitcases. He thought he had erased me from his shiny new future. I placed my index finger over the enter key on my keyboard. I took one final deep breath of the quiet city air. "Checkmate, Richard," I whispered to the empty room. I pressed the key down hard. The files transmitted instantly into the federal court system. The digital guillotine dropped, and the long, arrogant reign of Richard Sterling was officially over. The morning of the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Apex Tower was an absolute masterclass in corporate vanity and profound delusion. The skyscraper itself was a stunning architectural marvel of deep blue glass and cold polished steel that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a massive glittering spear. It was without question the undisputed crown jewel of the commercial real estate portfolio. The massive open-air plaza located at the base of the tower had been entirely transformed into a lavish theatrical stage designed solely to worship one man. A thick velvet red carpet stretched all the way from the busy city street directly to the grand entrance of the building. The plaza was swarming with elite financial reporters, local politicians, prominent city officials, and the most powerful real estate moguls on the eastern seaboard. The brilliant flashes of hundreds of press cameras popped rapidly, creating a blinding strobe light effect against the pristine glass facade. The air was thick with the smell of expensive designer cologne, fresh floral arrangements, and the intoxicating, undeniable scent of absolute unchecked power. It was exactly the kind of highly publicized high society spectacle that my husband lived for. Richard did not just want to be wealthy. He desperately needed to be worshipped by the masses. Standing center stage at the custom-clear lucite podium was Richard. He was 58 years old, but today he was trying desperately to project the boundless vitality of a man half his age. He wore a brand-new bespoke suit, tailored so tightly it practically squeezed the breath out of his lungs. His freshly veneered teeth gleamed unnaturally white under the harsh media spotlights. He leaned heavily into the microphone, gripping the sharp edges of the podium like a conquering general addressing his victorious loyal army. His voice boomed across the plaza, echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers with absolute authority. He spoke at great length to the captivated audience about his visionary genius, his relentless work ethic, and his unparalleled ability to shape the future of the city skyline. He told the eager reporters that the Apex Tower was a physical testament to his sheer willpower and his brilliant financial strategy. He painted a masterful, flawless picture of a self-made titan who had single-handedly dragged his company from the brink of obscurity to the absolute pinnacle of global finance. He did not mention the long, agonizing nights I spent balancing his ledgers. He did not mention the private offshore loans that kept him out of a federal bankruptcy court. He simply bathed in the thunderous applause, drinking in the adoration of a crowd that had absolutely no idea his entire empire was currently built on shifting financial quicksand. Standing right beside him, intimately sharing the intense media spotlight, was Chloe. She was 26 years old, and she was playing her role with sickening, practiced perfection. She was draped in a tailored white designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a morning corporate press conference, but perfectly suited for a young woman actively trying to secure her permanent place in high society. Around her delicate wrist and her neck, heavy diamond jewelry caught the bright morning sunlight and fractured it into a million blinding pieces. Those were the exact same diamonds she had purchased just days ago using the restricted corporate funds my husband had illegally transferred. She stood there smiling serenely, placing a perfectly manicured hand lightly on Richard's forearm to publicly signify her newly conquered territory. She looked out at the sea of reporters and flashing cameras with an expression of profound, undeniable smugness. She truly believed she had won the ultimate prize. She thought she had successfully navigated her way into a wealthy, powerful dynasty, completely unaware that the heavy diamonds resting against her collarbone were essentially the financial anchor that was about to drag her down to the dark bottom of the ocean. Flanking the happy couple on the elevated stage were my two biological children. They were standing tall and proud on a platform built entirely by the mother they had so easily discarded. Brandon, my 32-year-old son, stood directly to his father right. He was wearing his typical expensive tech bro uniform consisting of a dark tailored blazer over a designer t-shirt. He was looking out at the massive crowd with a deeply arrogant smirk, completely convinced that the massive success of the Apex Tower guaranteed the permanent survival of his own pathetic failing startup. He firmly believed the $2 million cash injection he had recently begged from his father was just the beginning of his endless bottomless trust fund. On the exact opposite side of the podium stood Olivia. My 28-year-old daughter was not even paying attention to her father's grand speech. She had her expensive smartphone raised high in the air, actively live-streaming the entire ribbon-cutting ceremony to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She was posing aggressively, pouting her lips and whispering softly into the camera, treating the absolute climax of her father's professional career as nothing more than a convenient aesthetic backdrop for her own social media brand. They looked like a perfect, modern, aristocratic family, united by pure greed and entirely detached from reality. They were soaking up the fame, the money, and the prestige without a single ounce of gratitude for the woman who had quietly engineered their entire existence. The massive crowd erupted into thunderous, cheering applause as Richard finally raised a pair of massive golden scissors high into the air. He smiled broadly for the flashing cameras and sliced cleanly through the wide red silk ribbon stretched across the grand entrance of the tower. The flashbulbs went completely frantic, capturing the historic moment from every possible angle. Bright gold and silver confetti rained down from the upper balconies, glittering beautifully in the morning sun. The reporters shouted out questions aggressively, begging for an exclusive quote from the man of the hour. Richard spread his arms wide, soaking it all in. He looked completely invincible. It was a beautiful, flawless performance, but it was entirely a lie. Because as they stood there smiling and waving to the adoring press, they were celebrating the grand opening of a building they no longer legally owned. The digital guillotine had already dropped the night before while they were out dancing. The federal asset seizure documents had already been processed and completely approved by a judge. The offshore trust had legally swallowed the land, the steel, the glass, and every single lucrative commercial lease inside that massive tower. Richard was currently standing on the front porch of my property, bragging to the entire world about a house he had just forfeited due to his own breathtaking stupidity. The celebration was at its absolute peak. The music was playing loud and clear over the speakers. The expensive champagne was flowing freely into crystal glasses. And that was the exact perfect moment for the actual owner of the building to arrive and completely burn their beautiful stage to the ground. The applause from the ribbon-cutting ceremony was still echoing off the towering glass walls of the Apex Tower when I made my grand entrance. I did not sneak in through a side door. I did not hide behind the massive crowd of wealthy spectators waiting for the event to end. I walked directly down the center of the plush red carpet. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray Armani suit. It was a severe structured garment. It was not a dress meant for a supportive, smiling corporate wife. It was the absolute, undeniable armor of a Wall Street risk analyst coming to collect a massive, outstanding debt. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, a slow and deliberate death march for my husband, fragile, arrogant ego. I was not alone. Walking perfectly in step to my right was Sarah, my terrifying corporate litigator. She held a thick black leather briefcase containing the emergency federal injunctions we had aggressively filed late last night. Walking to my left and flanking us completely from behind were 4 uniformed officers from the New York Police Department Financial Crimes Unit, alongside the senior county sheriff. Their heavy-duty utility belts and stern, uncompromising expressions completely shattered the carefully curated high society atmosphere of the morning press conference. The sea of elite financial reporters, local politicians, and wealthy real estate moguls began to physically part ways to let us through. A hushed, tense murmur rippled rapidly through the massive crowd. The camera flashes, which had previously been focused entirely on Richard, proudly holding the giant golden scissors, suddenly pivoted directly toward me. The media instantly recognized the visual power of the unfolding moment. The discarded 56-year-old wife was marching onto the stage with a severe legal team and a heavy police escort. On the elevated platform, Richard was just leaning back into the lucite microphone to deliver his final arrogant closing remarks. He looked up and saw me cutting through the absolute center of his adoring crowd. The color completely drained from his face in a matter of seconds. His freshly veneered smile collapsed into a tight, furious grimace. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard, his knuckles turned stark white. Standing right next to him, Chloe narrowed her eyes in profound annoyance. She placed her hands on her hips, her massive diamond ring catching the bright morning sunlight. She actually let out an audible theatrical sigh, clearly believing I was just a bitter, jealous older woman arriving to throw a desperate public tantrum and ruin her beautiful press photographs. Brandon, my visionary son, immediately pulled out his smartphone to text someone looking utterly mortified that his mother was causing a scene in front of his potential venture capital investors. Olivia lowered her live streaming camera, her jaw dropping open in absolute horror as she realized her perfect social media aesthetic was being completely destroyed by the presence of armed law enforcement walking down the red carpet. Richard recovered from his initial shock with the terrifying speed of a deeply narcissistic man. He firmly believed he was the untouchable king of Manhattan, and he was not going to let his aging ex-wife ruin the absolute climax of his professional career. He leaned directly into the microphone, his voice dropping into a deep, patronizing tone designed specifically to humiliate me in front of the assembled press. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, forcing a sad, sympathetic smile onto his face. "I deeply apologize for this unfortunate interruption. As many of you know, my family is currently navigating a very painful and highly personal transition. It seems my former wife is struggling severely with the reality of our separation and has decided to bring her emotional distress to a corporate event. Please excuse us while we handle this private domestic matter." Richard then turned his head and gave a sharp, aggressive nod to the head of his private corporate security team. A group of 4 massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces immediately stepped off the edge of the stage and began walking aggressively down the red carpet directly toward me. "Remove that woman from the plaza immediately," Richard commanded, pointing a thick, heavy finger right at my face. "Escort her completely off the premises. If she resists, call the local precinct and have her arrested for criminal trespassing and disturbing a private corporate event. I want her gone right now." The private security guards moved fast, their hands reaching out to grab my arms and physically drag me away from the flashing cameras. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground and looked Richard dead in the eye with a cold, peaceful smile. Before the private guards could even brush the fabric of my Armani suit, the 4 uniformed police officers surged forward, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of blue right in front of me. The county sheriff, a tall, imposing man with a thick gray mustache, rested his hand casually on his utility belt and glared directly at the head of the corporate security team. "I highly suggest you take 3 giant steps back, son," the sheriff warned, his voice echoing loudly in the tense, silent plaza. "If you or any of your men lay a single finger on this woman, I will personally arrest you for assaulting the lawful owner of this property." The private security guards froze instantly. They looked up at Richard in total panic, completely unsure of how to proceed against armed federal and local law enforcement. Richard's face flushed a deep, violent shade of purple. He leaned over the podium, screaming into the microphone. "Lawful owner," he roared, his voice cracking with intense, uncontrolled rage. "What the hell are you talking about, officer? I am the chief executive officer of Sterling Commercial Real Estate. I am the majority shareholder. I built this massive skyscraper with my own 2 hands. I own this entire plaza. I demand that you remove her from my property immediately." Sarah. My brilliant corporate litigator stepped smoothly around the wall of police officers. She walked calmly up the short set of stairs leading directly onto the elevated stage. She did not look intimidated by Richard's screaming or the hundreds of cameras pointing in her direction. She opened her thick black leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents bound with crisp blue backing paper. She slapped the documents down firmly onto the clear lucite podium right on top of Richard's carefully written speech notes. "You do not own a single square inch of this property, Mr. Sterling," Sarah stated, her voice ringing out crisp, clear, and absolutely devoid of any mercy. "And you are no longer the chief executive officer of anything. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the Federal Bankruptcy Court of the Southern District of New York has officially approved an emergency ex parte asset seizure order against your entire parent company." Sarah turned slightly to face the massive crowd of reporters, ensuring her voice carried directly into their recording devices. "My client, Victoria Sterling, is the primary managing director and sole beneficiary of V-Trust. Through a series of highly secure offshore financial instruments, my client holds exactly 65% of your total corporate debt structure. She is the shadow entity that financed this entire tower. And last night, Mr. Sterling, you flagrantly violated the core financial covenant of your massive commercial loan agreement by illegally wiring $8 million of restricted corporate funds to a luxury maritime broker in Monaco." The plaza erupted into absolute chaos. The reporters began shouting frantically, completely abandoning their polite press conference decorum. They smelled blood in the water, and it was the sweet metallic scent of a billionaire completely destroying his own life. The camera flashes intensified into a blinding, continuous white strobe light. Richard staggered backward, physically recoiling, as if Sarah had just punched him in the chest. He looked at the legal documents resting on the podium. He saw the official federal court stamps. He saw the undeniable proof of his own catastrophic financial suicide. He looked at Chloe, who was now backing away from him, her face pale with sudden terrifying realization. She looked down at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her skin, suddenly understanding that those jewels were bought with stolen, restricted money. Brandon dropped his smartphone onto the stage, his jaw trembling as he realized his endless trust fund and his $2 million startup injection had just evaporated into thin air. Olivia buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly as the harsh reality of absolute poverty crashed into her curated social media fantasy. I slowly walked up the stairs to join Sarah on the stage. I stepped directly in front of the clear, lucite podium, pushing Richard aside with a single, effortless wave of my hand. The police officers moved up behind me, securing the perimeter and ensuring Richard could not attempt any physical retaliation. I looked out at the massive sea of faces. I looked at the beautiful glass skyscraper towering above us, reflecting the bright morning sun, And then I looked at the man who had discarded me like trash just 3 days ago. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his custom Italian suit suddenly looking like a cheap, terrible costume. The arrogant titan of industry was gone. In his place stood a pathetic, desperate old man who had completely outsmarted himself. The sheer volume of the gasps from the assembled crowd sounded like a sudden rush of wind sweeping through the plaza. For a split second, nobody moved. Then absolute pandemonium erupted. The reporters who had been politely taking notes just minutes earlier suddenly surged forward, pressing against the velvet ropes. The flashes from their cameras became a blinding, continuous storm of white light, capturing every single micro-expression on my husband's face. Richard staggered backward, his expensive custom Italian leather shoes scraping clumsily against the polished wooden stage. He looked like a man who had just been violently woken up from a beautiful dream by a bucket of ice water. He shook his head wildly, his perfectly styled hair falling out of place. He reached out and grabbed the clear, lucite podium, gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles looked like they might shatter. "This is a joke!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with a panicked, hysterical pitch. He pointed a shaking finger at Sarah. "This is an absolute joke! This is a pathetic, desperate stunt orchestrated by a bitter woman who cannot handle the fact that our marriage is over. Turn the cameras off. I said turn them off right now. Security, get these lunatic women off my stage." But the security guards did not move an inch. They were staring at the 4 uniformed police officers and the county sheriff, who had essentially formed an impenetrable human shield around me. Richard looked out at the sea of elite investors and city politicians, expecting them to rush to his defense. He expected the powerful men he played golf with to silence this ridiculous interruption. But the wealthy men in the front row were already stepping back, pulling out their cell phones and frantically dialing their own legal teams. In the ruthless world of commercial real estate, nobody catches a falling knife. When a billionaire starts bleeding in public, his friends do not offer him a bandage. They start calculating how to buy his assets for pennies on the dollar. Sarah did not even flinch at his screaming. She simply opened her thick black leather briefcase wider and pulled out a massive stack of banking records. She slapped them down onto the podium right over his perfectly typed speech notes. The heavy thud of the paper echoed through the plaza microphone. "You can yell at the press all you want, Richard," Sarah stated, her voice sharp and entirely devoid of emotion. "But you cannot yell at the federal court system. These are the finalized asset seizure orders signed by a federal judge at 7 o'clock this morning. They are executed, verified, and entirely irreversible." Richard stared at the legal seals on the documents, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You cannot do this," he spat out, saliva flying from his lips. "You are just a divorce attorney, and she is just a housewife. You cannot seize a commercial property of this magnitude without a board vote. I am the chief executive officer. I own 60% of the voting shares. I built this company from the ground up with my own sweat and blood. I am a self-made titan. You cannot just walk in here with some fake paperwork and claim my tower." Sarah smiled a terrifying razor-sharp smile. She tapped her manicured fingernail directly against the bold black signature at the bottom of the master contract. "Equity is a beautiful illusion when you are drowning in toxic debt." Richard Sarah explained, speaking slowly and clearly so every single reporter could capture the quote. "You might hold the majority of the voting stock, but my client holds the vast majority of your corporate debt, and debt always trumps equity. You thought you were outsmarting the American banking system by securing a massive private offshore loan from the Cayman Islands. You bragged to your board of directors about your brilliant financial maneuvering. You signed a legally binding master agreement that pledged this exact physical building as direct collateral." Richard's face turned a sickly pale green, but the offshore trust, he stammered, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority. "The investors at V Trust assured me the terms were standard. They said I had a 5-year grace period on the principal. They said I was a priority client." Sarah let out a low, cold laugh that sent a visible shiver down Richard's spine. "V Trust does not have a board of investors, Richard. V Trust does not care about your grace period. And V Trust is certainly not located in the Cayman Islands. That was my cue." I stepped smoothly around the wall of police officers and walked directly up to the microphone. I pushed Richard aside with a single effortless wave of my hand. He stumbled backward, completely stripped of his power. I looked out at the massive crowd of reporters, investors, and politicians. The plaza was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. I leaned into the microphone. My voice was calm, smooth, and entirely steady. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years quietly managing risk. Trust is Victoria Trust, I announced. The words rang out across the plaza, bouncing off the towering glass walls of the skyscraper. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. I turned my head slowly and looked Richard dead in the eye. I am V. Trust Richard. I am the shadow entity you have been borrowing money from for the last 15 years. When you nearly bankrupted this entire family in 2008, I used my own private maternal inheritance to secretly buy up all of your toxic debt. I became your largest creditor. Every time you swiped a corporate card, every time you threw a lavish party, every time you bought a custom Italian suit to feed your massive ego, you were essentially taking a loan out from your own wife. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, like a fish suffocating on dry land. His brain was completely short-circuiting, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the financial trap he had been living inside. But the loan, he whispered, his voice trembling. The new loan for the tower. You approved it. I nodded, my expression entirely blank. Yes, Richard. I approve the massive loan you requested against the full appraised value of this tower yesterday afternoon. I gave you the exact rope you begged for. But you were far too arrogant to read the fine print. You were so desperate to impress your young mistress that you completely ignored Clause 4B of the Master Lending Agreement. I pointed a finger directly at his chest. Clause 4. B explicitly states that the disbursed funds are legally restricted for commercial property development and operational payroll only. It is an ironclad financial covenant. And last night at exactly 11:25 in the evening, you authorized an $8 million wire transfer from the restricted commercial account directly to a private luxury maritime brokerage firm in Monaco. You took commercial loan funds and you used them to buy a custom superyacht. The silence in the plaza shattered. The elite financial reporters began screaming into their recording devices, entirely losing their professional composure. The logic of the trap was completely flawless. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. Richard had committed textbook fraudulent wealth transfer in broad daylight, and he had handed the absolute legal right of seizure directly to his discarded wife. Richard's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the side of the stage to keep from collapsing onto the red carpet. "You set me up!" he gasped, tears of absolute terror welling in his eyes. "You entrapped me. You knew I was going to buy that boat for the wedding. You tricked me, Victoria. You cannot take my building." "I did not trick you, Richard," I replied, my voice echoing with icy finality. "I simply presented you with a mirror and let your own greed do the heavy lifting. You thought you could strip me of my home, my credit cards, and my dignity. You thought you could erase 30 years of my silent labor just because you wanted a younger woman to stroke your fragile ego. You thought you were the king of the world, but a king without any gold is just a clown in a very expensive suit." I stepped away from the podium and looked up at the towering, beautiful blue glass skyscraper shining in the morning sun. "I am officially invoking the immediate default protocol, Richard. The grace period is completely terminated. I am recalling the entire massive debt you owe me effective immediately. And since you cannot possibly pay me back, I am exercising my legal right to seize the collateral." I turned back to face him, delivering the final fatal blow. "I am taking back this building. I am taking the lucrative corporate leases inside of it. And I am taking the very ground you are standing on right now. This is my property. You are trespassing on my plaza. And you have exactly 2 minutes to gather your pathetic entourage and vacate my premises before I have the sheriff arrest you for criminal trespassing." The crowd went absolutely wild. The applause was not polite. It was a roar of genuine awe and absolute validation. The powerful men in the front row were staring at me with profound, unfiltered respect. I had just executed the most brilliant, aggressive, and legally sound hostile takeover in the history of the city. I was not a bitter crying housewife. I was the undisputed queen of the empire. Behind Richard, Chloe let out a piercing theatrical shriek. She ripped the heavy diamond necklace off her throat as if the jewels were suddenly burning her skin. She threw the expensive stones onto the wooden stage, recognizing immediately that they were purchased with stolen funds that would surely be investigated by federal agents. She did not even look at the man she had promised to marry. She turned on her high heels, pushed past the stunned security guards, and ran desperately down the stairs, disappearing into the chaotic crowd of reporters. She abandoned him the exact second his bank account hit zero. My son Brandon fell to his knees on the platform, clutching his head in his hands. His tech startup was dead. His endless trust fund was completely vaporized. He was going to have to actually apply for a job like a normal person, and the absolute terror of that reality was breaking his mind in real time. Olivia, my perfect influencer daughter, had dropped her smartphone entirely. The screen was cracked on the wooden floor, still live streaming the ultimate destruction of her wealthy socialite fantasy. She was weeping uncontrollably, her designer mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked at me, her eyes begging for the mother she had cruelly banished from the Thanksgiving table just a few days prior. But I offered her absolutely nothing. No comfort, no pity, no rescue. Richard sank slowly onto the floor of the stage, right next to the fallen clear lucite podium. He was surrounded by the massive stack of legal documents that officially declared his absolute ruin. He looked up at the towering Apex Tower, the building he had proudly claimed as his ultimate legacy. He realized with a crushing, suffocating despair that his name would be stripped from the lobby by the end of the afternoon. He was entirely bankrupt. He was facing massive federal investigations for the illegal wire transfers. He had lost his young, beautiful mistress, his social standing, and his entire fortune in less than 10 minutes. I adjusted the cuffs of my Armani suit and turned my back on the pathetic, sobbing mess of the family that had tried to destroy me. I walked down the short flight of stairs, escorted closely by the county sheriff and my brilliant attorney, Sarah. The crowd of reporters parted for me with absolute reverence, shouting my name, begging for an exclusive interview with the woman who had just conquered the Manhattan real estate market. I did not stop to answer their questions. I did not need to explain myself to anyone ever again. I walked off the red carpet and stepped into the back of a waiting black town car. The heavy door closed, shutting out the noise and the chaos. As the car pulled away from the plaza, I poured myself a small glass of sparkling water from the minibar. I took a slow, refreshing sip and smiled. The war was officially over, and the silence of my new empire was absolutely beautiful. The plaza was frozen in a surreal tableau. The elite financial reporters, usually loud and aggressive, were completely silent for a fraction of a second as their brains processed the sheer magnitude of the corporate slaughter they had just witnessed. Then the silence broke. It shattered into a million pieces as the press corps erupted. They shouted questions, their camera flashes firing like a continuous strobe light, capturing the exact moment a self-made billionaire became a highly publicized criminal. Richard was still gripping the clear lucite podium, but his knuckles were no longer white from anger. They were white from absolute, paralyzing terror. He looked down at the heavy stack of federal asset seizure documents resting under my hand. The official blue ink of the federal judge's signature was the final nail in the coffin of his 30-year empire. He had no money. He had no building. He had massive federal tax liabilities and an impending criminal investigation for fraudulent wealth transfer. He was in every measurable metric completely destroyed. I turned my gaze slightly to observe his beautiful young future bride. Chloe was standing just a few feet away from him, but the emotional distance between them was rapidly expanding into a massive, unbridgeable canyon. She was staring at Richard with wide, horrified eyes. She was a woman who had calculated her entire life based on the exact net worth of the men she dated. She had tolerated his aging body, his massive ego, and his condescending lectures because the final payout was supposed to be a lifetime of unlimited luxury. She had pictured private jets, Mediterranean superyachts, and endless shopping sprees in Paris. Now she was looking at a man who was about to be investigated by the federal government. She looked down at the massive, blinding diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. I could practically see the gears turning in her completely selfish mind. She realized with terrifying clarity that the jewelry she was wearing had been purchased with stolen, restricted commercial loan funds. Those diamonds were not a gift. They were physical evidence of a federal crime. Chloe did not hesitate. The survival instincts of a gold digger are sharp and utterly ruthless. She reached up to her neck and fumbled frantically with the delicate platinum clasp. Her manicured fingernails tore at the metal until the heavy diamond necklace fell away from her skin. She dropped it onto the wooden stage as if the expensive stones were physically burning her flesh. Then she looked at her left hand. The massive engagement ring Richard had given her caught the morning sunlight. She gripped the diamond, pulled it off her finger, and took one aggressive step toward my ruined husband. Richard looked up at her, his eyes pleading for comfort, desperately hoping that at least his young trophy wife would stand by his side in his darkest hour. "Richard, you are a complete idiot," Chloe hissed. Her voice was sharp, venomous, and entirely captured by the dozens of microphones positioned on the stage. "You told me you owned this city. You told me you were a genius. You are nothing but a broke, fraudulent old man who got completely outsmarted by his housewife." Chloe raised her hand and threw the heavy diamond engagement ring directly at his face. The ring struck his cheekbone with a sharp, sickening click and bounced off, rolling away across the red carpet. Without another word, Chloe turned her back on him. She hiked up the skirt of her custom white designer dress, pushed her way aggressively through the stunned corporate security guards, and sprinted down the stairs. She disappeared into the chaotic crowd of reporters, abandoning him the exact second his bank account hit zero. Richard reached up with a trembling hand to touch his cheek where the diamond had struck him, but he could not even process the physical sting. The emotional humiliation was absolute. Beside him, the entitled heir to the empty kingdom was experiencing his own catastrophic system failure. My 32-year-old son, Brandon, was staring blankly at his expensive smartphone. He was the visionary entrepreneur who had just blown $2 million of stolen money on a useless office space in Brooklyn. He had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one failure to another, always relying on the massive safety net of his father, immense wealth. Now that net was gone. The ground was rushing up to meet him at terminal velocity. Brandon fell heavily to his knees right there on the wooden platform. He clutched his head in his hands, his expensive, tailored blazer wrinkling as he rocked back and forth. His endless trust fund was completely vaporized. He was going to have to actually write a resume. He was going to have to apply for a job. He was going to have to learn how to survive in the real world without a platinum credit card, and the absolute paralyzing terror of that reality was breaking his fragile mind in real time. I watched my son collapse into a pathetic, whimpering heap, and I felt absolutely nothing. He had chosen the money over my dignity, and now he had neither. On the opposite side of the stage, the social media facade had violently crumbled. My 28-year-old daughter, Olivia, had dropped her phone. The screen was shattered on the floor. The live stream abruptly ended right as the ultimate destruction of her wealthy socialite fantasy was broadcasted to hundreds of thousands of followers. She collapsed onto the wooden planks, her designer gown pooling around her. She was weeping uncontrollably, letting out loud, gasping sobs that echoed over the plaza speakers. Her expensive mascara was running down her face in thick, dark, ugly streaks. She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, desperately begging for the mother she had cruelly banished from the Thanksgiving dinner table just a few days prior. "Mom, please," Olivia wailed, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. "Mom, you cannot do this. You have to fix this. My friends are watching. My entire life is ruined. Please help me." I did not take a single step toward her. I offered her no comfort, no pity, and absolutely no rescue. She had made her bed with the mistress, and now she was going to lie in the ashes of it. Before Olivia could crawl any closer to me, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows of the VIP section. It was Marcus. My brilliant, honorable African-American son-in-law had quietly arrived to witness the execution. He was no longer wearing his corporate uniform. He was dressed in a casual, sharp, dark coat, looking completely relaxed and entirely unbothered by the blazing inferno consuming his former employer. Marcus walked directly onto the stage, ignoring the frantic reporters and the flashing cameras. He stepped right past Richard, not even offering the ruined billionaire a single glance. He walked up to his hysterical wife and grabbed her firmly by the upper arm. "Stand up," Olivia Marcus commanded. His deep voice cut through her pathetic sobbing with absolute, uncompromising authority. "The free ride is officially over. You are going to go home. You are going to pack a reasonably priced suitcase, and you are going to start looking for a job." Olivia shrieked, trying to pull away from his iron grip, but Marcus did not let go. He hauled her to her feet with effortless strength. "But my brand," she cried, gesturing wildly to her shattered phone. "My sponsorships, my inheritance." Marcus looked down at her with a mixture of profound exhaustion and cold reality. "You do not have an inheritance, Olivia," he stated flatly. "Your father is a broke criminal, and your mother just rightfully evicted all of us. Now start walking before you embarrass yourself any further." Marcus turned his head and looked directly at me. Across the ruined stage, amidst the screaming press and the falling corporate empire, our eyes met. He gave me a slow, deep, and incredibly respectful nod. It was the silent acknowledgement of a brilliant strategist recognizing the undisputed queen of the board. He did not ask me for money. He did not ask me for mercy. He simply accepted the ruthless justice I had delivered. I returned his nod with a small, genuine smile of approval. Marcus turned around and half-carried, half-dragged his weeping, hysterical wife down the stairs and away from the cameras. He was a good man, and he was finally going to force my spoiled daughter to face the real world. I was left standing on the elevated stage, flanked by the unwavering wall of armed police officers. I looked down at the wreckage of my former family. Richard was still gripping the lucite podium, his face buried in his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked 20 years older than he had when he cut the red ribbon just 15 minutes ago. Brandon was still curled into a fetal position on the floor, completely paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of having to work for a living. They were frozen in time, two arrogant men, entirely unable to compute a reality where they were no longer the smartest, wealthiest people in the room. They were completely alone, stripped of their assets, stripped of their sycophants, and entirely stripped of their pride. I reached out and gently closed the heavy black leather binder resting on the podium. I did not need to say another word. The silence of their defeat was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I turned my back on the pathetic, sobbing mess of the men who had tried to erase my entire existence. I walked down the short flight of stairs, escorted closely by the county sheriff and my brilliant attorney, Sarah. The massive crowd of elite reporters parted for me with absolute reverence, shouting my name, begging for an exclusive interview with the woman who had just conquered the Manhattan real estate market. I did not stop. I did not answer their frantic questions. I did not need to explain myself to anyone ever again. I walked off the red carpet and stepped into the back of a waiting black luxury town car. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly shutting out the noise, the chaos, and the ghosts of my past. As the car pulled smoothly away from the magnificent glass skyscraper I now fully owned, I leaned back into the plush leather seat. I poured myself a small glass of sparkling water from the minibar, took a slow, refreshing sip, and smiled. The war was officially over, and my new life was just beginning. 30 days is a remarkably short amount of time for an entire wealthy dynasty to turn into absolute dust. Exactly 1 month after I stood on the red carpet and legally seized the Apex Tower, the smoke had finally cleared over the Manhattan skyline. I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in the highest executive penthouse suite of my new building. The heavy leather chair that Richard used to occupy felt incredibly comfortable and perfectly suited for my posture. I was sipping a cup of imported green tea and quietly reviewing the quarterly profit margins for the commercial real estate empire I now completely owned. Without my former husband constantly draining the corporate accounts to feed his massive, fragile ego, the company was actually operating at a record-breaking financial surplus. But while I was enjoying the absolute tranquility of my new life, my ungrateful family was actively drowning in the brutal, unforgiving reality of the real world. I did not even have to seek out information about their miserable new circumstances. The high society gossip circles and my brilliant legal team provided me with highly entertaining daily updates. Richard was currently living through a terrifying nightmare of his own specific design. The federal authorities did not take his flagrant violation of commercial lending laws lightly. The morning after the disastrous ribbon-cutting ceremony, agents from the Financial Crimes Division raided his temporary luxury hotel suite. They formally indicted him on multiple federal counts of corporate fraud, unauthorized wealth transfer, and wire fraud. Because I had successfully and legally seized all of his liquid assets through the V-Trust default protocol, he could not even afford to hire a decent defense attorney. The aggressive cutthroat corporate lawyers he used to play golf with immediately stopped returning his phone calls the exact second his platinum credit card started declining. He was completely abandoned by the wealthy sycophants who used to drink his expensive champagne. The luxury superyacht in Monaco was immediately impounded by international maritime authorities before he ever got the chance to step foot on the teak deck. According to Sarah, my lead litigator Richard was currently renting a damp, extremely small one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood out in Queens. He was spending his miserable days taking the public subway to the downtown courthouse, trying desperately to negotiate a plea deal that would keep him out of a federal penitentiary. The arrogant titan of industry was completely gone. He was reduced to a pathetic, sweating older man, facing a minimum of 10 years in prison, and he had absolutely no one to blame but himself. My eldest son Brandon was faring no better in the real world. The $2 million cash injection he had begged from his father was swiftly clawed back by the federal bankruptcy court during the initial asset seizure process. His ridiculous visionary technology startup completely imploded in less than 48 hours. The massive loft office space in Brooklyn was locked by the commercial landlord, and his team of private organic chefs and overpaid technical consultants immediately sued him for unpaid wages. Because Brandon had foolishly signed personal financial guarantees on the commercial leases, truly believing his endless family trust fund would always protect him, he was now personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. For the first time in his 32 years of life, the pampered entrepreneur was forced to actually enter the manual labor workforce. He was currently working the closing shift as a waiter at a loud, overcrowded chain restaurant in New Jersey. He was wearing a cheap polyester uniform, serving greasy appetizers to angry customers, and wiping down sticky tables until 2 a.m. just to afford his minimum credit card payments. The sheer poetic justice of my spoiled, arrogant son, coming home with blistered feet and smelling like fried food, was almost too perfect to put into words. He had treated my decades of silent household labor with absolute contempt, and now he was quite literally forced to serve others to survive. And then there was Olivia. My 28-year-old influencer daughter had her carefully curated internet aesthetic completely and violently shattered. The day after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Marcus followed through on his ultimate promise. He was a man of absolute integrity, and he adamantly refused to drown in the toxic financial waste of his wife and her family. Marcus took full militant control of their household finances. He immediately canceled every single secondary credit card in Olivia's name. When she threw a massive hysterical tantrum crying about her fake brand deals and her upcoming Fashion Week appearances, Marcus remained completely stone cold. He calmly walked into her massive walk-in closet and packed up every single imported designer handbag, custom gown, and pair of diamond earrings she had purchased with my money over the last year. He sold them all to a luxury consignment broker to pay off the massive retail debt she had carelessly accumulated. Marcus then sat her down at their kitchen table and handed her a printed job application for a local administrative assistant position alongside a thick stack of finalized divorce papers. He told her she had exactly 1 week to secure a standard 9-to-5 job and start contributing actual cash to their monthly mortgage, or he was going to sign the divorce decree and leave her with absolutely nothing. Faced with the terrifying prospect of total abandonment, Olivia completely folded. According to the silent, respectful nods Marcus gave me when we occasionally passed each other in the financial district, Olivia was currently working 40 hours a week. She was answering phones, formatting spreadsheets, and fetching coffee for a mid-level accounting firm. Her perfectly manicured hands were now typing out boring corporate memos. She had deleted her social media accounts entirely out of sheer absolute embarrassment, unable to face her wealthy followers now that she was just a regular working-class citizen. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, observing the busy streets of Manhattan far below. My family had spent my entire adult life treating me like an invisible, useless piece of furniture. They had drained my energy, my patience, and my secret wealth to build their own arrogant fantasies. But the fire they tried to throw me into had only forged me into something entirely unbreakable. They were living in the absolute ashes of their own greed, while I was comfortably sitting on the throne they had unknowingly built for me. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of relentless driving Manhattan rain that cuts right through your clothes and chills you to the absolute bone. I was sitting comfortably in the expansive living room of my new primary residence, which was a $50 million penthouse overlooking the dark, beautiful expanse of Central Park. I was wearing a thick, plush cashmere robe, holding a crystal glass of imported Italian red wine, and listening to the soft, soothing crackle of my massive marble fireplace. The brutal, harsh reality of the city streets felt a million miles away. Then the secure private intercom mounted on my wall chimed softly. The head of building security, a former military officer who took my privacy extremely seriously, politely informed me that I had 3 unauthorized visitors standing outside the private reinforced glass gates of the lobby. He stated that they were completely soaked aggressive and adamantly refusing to leave the premises. He offered to call the local police precinct immediately to have them removed for loitering, but I told him to hold off. I instructed him to patch the external video feed directly to the massive flat-screen television mounted above my fireplace. I wanted to see them. I pressed a single button on my remote control, and the high-definition camera feed flickered to life, illuminating my dark living room. Standing there in the pouring, freezing rain, looking exactly like completely drowned rats, were the 3 people who had proudly thrown me away exactly 1 month ago. Richard was no longer wearing his custom-tailored Italian suits or flashing his expensive gold watch. He was shivering violently in a cheap, thin trench coat, his thinning gray hair plastered wetly to his forehead. Beside him stood Brandon, my 32-year-old visionary son. He was hunched over aggressively, rubbing his arms for warmth and wearing the cheap polyester uniform from his new job as a restaurant waiter. Clutching her brother's arm was Olivia. My perfect influencer daughter had her expensive hair extensions matted tightly to her face, and her designer makeup was washed completely away, leaving her looking exhausted, defeated, and remarkably ordinary. The sheer aesthetic contrast between the glittering corporate titans they pretended to be at the country club and the pathetic, shivering beggars standing in the flooded gutter was absolutely staggering. I tapped the audio icon on my digital tablet, allowing their desperate voices to transmit clearly into my warm, luxurious living room. Victoria, my former husband, pleaded, his voice cracking pathetically over the external intercom speaker. "Please, Victoria, you have to tell the guards to let us upstairs. We are freezing out here in the dark. I have absolutely nothing left." The federal prosecutors froze my last remaining personal checking account this morning to cover the corporate fines. I cannot even afford to turn the heat on in my miserable apartment. Richard actually fell to his knees right there on the wet concrete of the Manhattan sidewalk, completely ignoring the fact that wealthy pedestrians were walking past and openly staring at the ruined billionaire. He looked directly up at the glowing red light of the security camera, his hands clasped tightly together in desperate theatrical prayer. It was Chloe, he sobbed loudly, wiping the heavy rain and the bitter tears from his face. "She completely manipulated me, Victoria. She took advantage of my midlife vulnerability and my corporate stress. She filled my head with absolute poison and convinced me to push you away. I was confused and I made a terrible, catastrophic mistake. But I am still the exact same man you married 30 years ago. I am still the father of your children. Please just open the gate and let me come inside. We are a family, and we belong together. I am willing to forgive you for taking the company if you just let me come home." I took a slow, appreciative sip of my red wine, letting the rich oak flavor settle warmly on my tongue. He was actually offering to forgive me. The absolute audacity of his narcissistic delusion was almost mathematically impressive. Before I could even process the ridiculous, offensive statement, my daughter Olivia shoved her way toward the camera lens. "Mom, please." Olivia wailed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing over the roaring city traffic. "Marcus is being completely unreasonable and cruel to me. He forces me to take the crowded public subway to work every single morning. He makes me mathematically budget my weekly grocery money, and he refuses to buy me new clothes. I cannot live like this, Mom. I am developing severe clinical anxiety from the poverty. You proved your brilliant point, okay? You won the war. You showed Dad and the entire city exactly who is the boss. Now please, just open the V Trust financial accounts back up and let us go back to normal." Brandon violently pushed his crying sister aside, stepping directly into the frame. His face was pale and stretched tight with absolute desperation. "Mom, I am serving greasy fried calamari to rude teenagers every single night," he cried, his voice breaking into a humiliating sob. "I have massive chemical burns on my hands from the cheap industrial dish soap they force me to use in the kitchen. I am a chief executive officer, not a servant. We are your flesh and blood, Mom. You carried us for 9 months. You raised us in that beautiful estate. You cannot just sit up there in your warm billionaire penthouse and watch your own biological children suffer like this in the cold rain. We are so incredibly sorry for what happened at the country club. We love you, Mom. We will do absolutely whatever you want us to do. Just please give us our trust funds back and save us from this nightmare." I sat perfectly still in the absolute quiet of my secure living room, watching my biological family completely debase themselves on the wet concrete. They were actively using the exact same emotional manipulation tactics they had successfully utilized for the last 3 decades of my life. They threw the heavy words love and family and blood around like cheap casino chips, desperately hoping I was still the naive domestic housewife who would easily fold at the first sign of their physical discomfort. They wanted me to feel an overwhelming surge of maternal guilt. They wanted me to rush down to the lobby, wrap them in warm towels, and hand them the keys to my empire. But as I watched them shivering and crying in the dark, I realized a profound and beautiful truth. They did not actually miss me. They did not care about my emotional well-being or my personal happiness. They only missed my invisible unpaid labor and my limitless offshore bank accounts. They were crying exclusively for the money, not for the mother. I placed my crystal wine glass gently onto the marble coffee table. I picked up the digital intercom microphone and prepared to deliver the absolute final blow to the people who used to call me family. I picked up the heavy digital intercom microphone resting on my marble coffee table. I pressed the silver button to open the 2-way audio feed. The soft electronic chime echoed loudly down to the flooded street below. The 3 of them instantly stopped crying and looked up at the security camera with wide, desperate eyes. They looked like starving stray animals waiting for scraps from a master they had previously bitten. Victoria Richard gasped, his voice trembling with pathetic false hope. "Thank God you are listening to us. Please just tell the guards to let us in." I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the smooth, glacial calm of a woman who had completely excised a massive toxic infection from her life. "The high price of your betrayal is not going to be paid with a few cheap tears in the rain, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the storm like a physical blade. "You do not actually miss me. You only miss my invisible free labor and my limitless offshore bank accounts. You eagerly threw me away for a shiny new toy, and you fully expected me to quietly disappear into the background. But I am the hidden architect of your entire fake empire, and I do not surrender my throne to useless parasites." Brandon started to sob much louder aggressively, begging for his massive trust fund to be reinstated. Olivia screamed at the camera that she was my biological daughter, and she fundamentally deserved my money to survive. I let them wail and embarrass themselves on the public street for a few more seconds before I delivered the absolute final execution blow. "There is no more trust fund," I announced cleanly and clearly. "I have officially liquidated the entire remaining balance of V Trust. I transferred every single massive financial asset into a newly formed global charitable foundation. It is a charity specifically designed to provide aggressive legal representation for women facing corporate and financial domestic abuse. I used your entire massive inheritance to make sure arrogant men exactly like your father can never destroy another woman again. You get absolutely nothing from me ever again. Now get off my doormat before I have the armed guards physically throw you into the street." I released the silver button. I did not wait to hear their agonizing screams of absolute defeat. I reached over and completely severed the external video feed. The massive flat-screen television went entirely black, shutting out their pathetic, ruined faces forever. I sat back on my plush velvet sofa and took a slow, deep breath of the quiet, warm air. The brutal war was completely over, and I had entirely won. 6 months later, the freezing, miserable rain of Manhattan was nothing more than a distant, fading memory. I was sitting comfortably on the expansive, sun-drenched balcony of my private luxury villa located right on the edge of Lake Como in Italy. The crisp morning air smelled of fresh, blooming lemon trees, and the deep blue water glittered beautifully under the warm, bright afternoon sun. I was wearing a flowing white linen designer dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat. The heavy, suffocating weight of my 30-year marriage was completely gone, replaced by the absolute pure lightness of total financial and emotional freedom. I was not a forgotten aging housewife anymore. I was a sovereign, wealthy queen presiding over my own beautiful, peaceful life. I reached out and picked up a tall, salted margarita resting on the glass patio table next to me. I took a slow, refreshing sip, enjoying the perfect sharp bite of the fresh lime and the premium tequila. This was my fabulous, glorious second act. My cell phone buzzed softly against the glass table. I picked it up and opened my secure encrypted email application. There was a new message waiting in my inbox from Marcus. My brilliant, honorable former son-in-law had officially finalized his divorce from my spoiled daughter, entirely cutting her toxic, selfish presence out of his life. He was now operating his own highly successful corporate compliance law firm back in the financial district of New York. The email he sent was brief, but it was filled with profound, genuine gratitude. He was writing to formally thank his anonymous silent partner for the massive angel investment that allowed him to secure his premium office space and hire his elite legal staff. He knew exactly who the anonymous billionaire investor was, but he respected the corporate game far too much to ever say my name out loud. Marcus was the only person in that entire poisoned family who actually possessed a strong moral compass, and I was more than happy to financially reward his unwavering integrity. Biology is simply a random accident, but true family is a deliberate, careful choice. I locked my smartphone screen and set the device down on the table. I picked up my expensive, oversized designer sunglasses and slid them onto my face, completely blocking out the brilliant Italian sun. I leaned back deeply into my plush lounge chair and looked out over the endless, shimmering blue water of the lake. I had walked completely through an absolute inferno to get to this peaceful balcony, and I did not have a single burn mark to show for it. I built an empire in the shadows. I watched my enemies destroy themselves with their own blinding greed, and I emerged entirely victorious. Family is supposed to be a beautiful, comforting gift, but if that gift comes attached to toxic financial malware, you have to be brave enough to throw it directly into the trash. You have the ultimate power to pack your bags to secure your own assets and to completely rewrite the ending of your own glorious story. Age is not an expiration date. It is simply your ultimate strategic advantage. If this story resonated with you today, and if you have ever had to quietly build an empire while an arrogant man took all the credit, please do me a massive favor. Let me know exactly what you would do if you caught your husband buying a superyacht for his young mistress. Leave a comment down below, hit that like button, and make sure to subscribe to join our growing community of strong, unbreakable women. Thank you for listening to my journey today, and please remember to always keep your passwords completely to yourself.